Hi there, YouTube, Bethlehem. Welcome back to our podcast, where we dive into the fascinating world of countries and cultures. We're to bring you a brand new episode, powered by the awesome folks at JetOff AI, who help us make this magic happen.
That's right, Mira. And we're kicking off this episode with a story from our previous podcast. Remember when I accidentally spilled coffee all over my shirt? Well, I've been living with the stains ever since. And I've even started a coffee-themed fashion trend in my neighborhood.
Oh, Leo, you're such a trooper. But, in all seriousness, we've got a great episode lined up for you today. We're going to compare to countries that might not be on your radar, but trust us, they're worth exploring. So, let's get started.
That's right. Mira, today, we're talking about Canada and Tajikistan. Two countries that couldn't be more different, but both are amazing in their own ways. And, as always, we'll be answering all your questions and providing you with a comprehensive guide to help you make informed decisions.
That's right, Leo. And, as always, we want to hear from you. So if you have any questions or topics you'd like to discuss, feel free to leave them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Mira! And, as a special treat, we'll be sharing some fun facts and anecdotes about each country. So, grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and let's dive into the wonderful world of Canada and Tajikistan.
That's right, Leo. And, as we always say, the more you know, the more you'll love. Let's get started and explore these two incredible countries together.
Sounds like a plan. Mira. And, to make it even more interesting, we'll be sharing some of our own personal experiences and insights. So, buckle up, folks, and get ready for a wild ride.
Ha! Well tried. Indeed. Leo. But, in all seriousness, we want to assure you that we'll be providing you with accurate and helpful information. So, sit back, relax, and let us guide you through the wonderful world of Canada and Tajikistan.
That's right, Mira. And, as a special thank you to our loyal listeners, we'll be giving away a few prizes at the end of this episode. So, stay tuned and don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.
That's right, Leo. And we want to thank our amazing team at JetOff AI for their support and guidance. They help us make this podcast possible, and we're grateful for their hard work and dedication.
Absolutely. Mira. And, with that, let's get started on our journey through Canada and Tajikistan. We'll be exploring everything from culture and cuisine to history and geography. So, grab a pen and paper, and let's get ready to learn.
I'm to dive into the world of general safety and crime rates with Canada and Tajikistan. Let's start with Canada, shall we? What comes to mind when you think of this country's safety record?
Oh, Canada. The land of maple syrup and friendly folks, right? But seriously, Canada has a reputation for being one of the safest countries in the world. Low crime rates, excellent law enforcement, and a strong social safety net all contribute to its safe environment.
That's true. But what about the smaller towns and cities? Do they have the same level of safety as the bigger cities like Toronto and Vancouver?
Well, Canada's smaller towns and cities tend to be even safer than the big cities. With a lower population density and a strong sense of community, these areas often have lower crime rates. Plus, the police presence is usually more visible and responsive.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Canada would agree with me that the country's strong social safety net is a major factor in its low crime rates. But what about Tajikistan? How does its safety record compare to Canada's?
Tajikistan, a country with a rich history and stunning natural beauty. However, when it comes to safety, Tajikistan has a more, let's say, colorful reputation. Petty crime, corruption, and even some violent crime are concerns in certain areas.
That's a good point. Leo, but what about the government's efforts to improve safety in Tajikistan? Are there any initiatives in place to address crime and corruption?
Actually, The Tajik government has been working to improve safety and security in the country. They've implemented various measures, such as increasing the number of police officers and improving their training, as well as cracking down on corruption.
I'm curious to know. Leo, have you ever been to Tajikistan? What was your experience like?
Well, Mira, I've never been to Tajikistan, but I've heard it's a challenging but rewarding destination. From what I've read, the country's natural beauty, rich culture, and friendly people make it a unique and fascinating place to visit.
I think our listeners would love to hear more about your experiences in Canada. Leo, what's the most safety-conscious city you've visited in Canada?
That's a great question. Mira, I'd say Vancouver is one of the safest cities I've visited in Canada. With its strong police presence, low crime rates, and vibrant arts and culture scene, Vancouver is a great example of a safe and welcoming city.
I'm glad to hear that. Leo, and for our listeners who are planning a trip to Canada, what's one safety tip you'd recommend?
Well, Mira, I'd say be aware of your surroundings, especially in crowded areas or tourist hotspots. And don't be afraid to ask for help or directions from locals. Canadians are known for their hospitality and willingness to assist.
That's great advice. Now, let's talk about the cultural factors that shape safety and crime rates in Canada and Tajikistan. What do you think is the most significant cultural factor influencing safety in these countries?
That's a tough one, Mira. But I think one of the most significant cultural factors is the concept of community and social responsibility. In Canada, for example, there's a strong emphasis on community policing and social programs that aim to prevent crime and promote social cohesion.
I agree. Leo, and what about Tajikistan? How does its cultural context influence safety and crime rates?
Well, in Tajikistan, the cultural context is more complex. With a history of conflict and social unrest, the country has a more tense and unpredictable environment. However, the Tajik people are known for their hospitality and resilience, and there are many community-based initiatives working to promote safety and security.
I'm curious to know. Leo, how do you think the two countries compare in terms of their approach to crime and punishment?
That's a great question. Mira, Canada has a more rehabilitative approach to crime, focusing on rehabilitation and reintegration into society. In contrast, Tajikistan has a more punitive approach, with a focus on punishment and deterrence.
I see. And what about others who are interested in learning more about safety and crime rates in Canada and Tajikistan? Where can they go for more information?
Well, Mira, there are many resources available online, including government websites, crime statistics, and travel advisories. Our listeners can also check out travel blogs and forums for first-hand experiences and advice from travelers.
Great resources. Leo, and finally, what's one safety tip you give to our listeners who are planning a trip to either Canada or Tajikistan?
Well, Mira, I'd say be prepared for anything, and always trust your instincts. And don't forget to enjoy the incredible natural beauty and cultural richness of both countries.
Excellent advice. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of our podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know in the comments section below. Tied into Canada and Tajikistan's political stability and social harmony. Both countries have their unique approaches to governance, but what can we learn from them?
Great topic. I'm curious to see how Canada's reputation for being a tolerant and accepting society compares to Tajikistan's more conservative and authoritarian government. I mean, have you seen the Tajikistan flag? It's like a superhero cape.
Okay, Leo, focus. But I have to say, I've always been fascinated by Canada's multiculturalism. I'm sure our listeners living in Canada would agree with me that it's a melting pot of cultures.
Yeah. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard it's got a pretty complex history, with the Soviet Union's influence still lingering.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting. Tajikistan's government has been working to promote social harmony and stability. But it's not without its challenges. I'd love to hear our listeners' thoughts on this topic. Do you think Tajikistan's government is doing enough to promote social harmony?
Well, I think it's safe to say that Canada's got a bit more freedom, shall we say. But seriously, both countries have their own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to social harmony.
Okay, Leon, you're a bit biased, I think. But seriously, Canada's government has made significant efforts to promote social harmony and inclusion. For example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been working to address the legacy of residential schools and promote reconciliation with Indigenous peoples.
That's really impressive. And I think Tajikistan could learn a thing or two from Canada's approach to reconciliation. But, Tajikistan's got its own unique challenges, like the fact that many people still rely on traditional practices and customs.
Ah, yes. And that's where Jet Off AI comes in. They got some great resources on Tajikistan's cultural and social dynamics, which can help us better understand the complexities of social harmony in the country.
Yeah, because nothing says fun like reading about government policies on cultural traditions.
Okay. But seriously, folks, understanding the cultural context is key to grasping social harmony. And I think both Canada and Tajikistan have a lot to teach us on this front.
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that both countries have made significant progress in promoting social harmony and stability. It's not always easy, but it's worth the effort.
Well, I'm curious to hear our listeners' thoughts on this topic. If you think Tajikistan's government is doing enough to promote social harmony, please let us know in the comments. And if you have any insights or experiences to share, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, because nothing says social harmony like a good old-fashioned online debate.
Okay, Leo, focus. But seriously, folks, social harmony is a complex issue, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. But by learning from each other's strengths and weaknesses, I think we can make progress.
Absolutely. And I think that's the beauty of comparing Canada and Tajikistan's approaches to social harmony. It's a chance to learn from each other and promote understanding and respect.
I'm curious to know, Leo, what's the average salary range in Canada for an expat? Considering the cost of living in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver.
Great question. Mira, according to various sources, the average salary range for expats in Canada can vary depending on factors like industry, experience, and location. However, a rough estimate for a mid-level manager in Toronto would be around $80. $0 to $120. So, I think that we can cover that. $0 per year.
That's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners living in Canada would agree that the cost of living in Toronto and Vancouver can be quite high. But what about the job market? How would you describe it in Canada compared to Tajikistan?
Well, Mira, Canada has a very strong job market, with a relatively low unemployment rate of around 5.6%. This is due in part to the country's diverse economy, which includes industries like finance, technology, and healthcare. In contrast, Tajikistan's job market is more challenging, with a higher unemployment rate of around 13.5%.
That's a significant difference. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the cost of living in Tajikistan. Can you tell us a bit about the average rent prices and food costs in Dushanbe and other major cities?
Yes. Rent prices in Dushanbe can be quite affordable, with a one-bedroom apartment in the city center costing around $100, $150 per month. However, food costs can be a bit higher, especially for imported goods. A meal at a mid-range restaurant can cost around $5.10, while a kilogram of fresh meat can cost around $3.05.
Well, that's a great comparison. And I'm sure our listeners would be interested in knowing more about the economic growth in Canada and Tajikistan. Can you tell us a bit about the GDP growth rates in both countries?
Great question. Mira, Canada's GDP growth rate has been around 3% in recent years, while Tajikistan's GDP growth rate has been around 7-8%. This is due in part to Tajikistan's growing mining industry, which has driven economic growth in the country.
That's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax system in Canada and Tajikistan. Can you tell us a bit about the tax rates and any tax incentives that might be available to expats?
Oh, yes. Canada has a relatively complex tax system, with tax rates ranging from 15% to 33%. However, expats may be eligible for tax credits and deductions, such as the foreign tax credit. In Tajikistan, the tax rate is around 10-20%. And expats may be eligible for tax incentives, such as a reduced tax rate on foreign source income.
Thank you, Leo, for sharing your insights on the economic conditions and cost of living in Canada and Tajikistan. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot from this conversation, and we'd love to hear from them in the comments below.
Absolutely. Mira! And I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Canada and Tajikistan offer unique opportunities and challenges for expats. Whether it's the high cost of living in Canada or the economic growth in Tajikistan, there's always something to learn and explore.
Well, that's all for this segment on economic conditions and cost of living. Stay tuned for our next segment, where we'll be discussing the education system in Canada and Tajikistan.
And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more updates and insights on living and working abroad. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.
So, when it comes to accommodation options and quality in Canada, I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's a paradise for renters. From cozy apartments to spacious houses, the choices are endless. And let's not forget about the amenities: heated pools, gyms, and even a unit laundry. Who wouldn't love that?
Ah, but have you considered the cost? Mira, Canada's not exactly known for being affordable, especially in cities like Vancouver and Toronto. I'm sure our listeners would agree that a one-bedroom apartment in the city center can cost an arm and a leg.
Well, yes, but that's what makes it a paradise for renters, right? The quality of life is just so high in Canada. And let's be real, who needs a backyard when you have a beautiful park just a stone's throw away? Have you ever been to High Park in Toronto? It's like a slice of heaven on earth.
I'm sure it is. Mira, but let's talk about something a bit more practical. In Canada, you'll find a wide range of accommodation options, from luxury condos to cozy bed and breakfasts. And of course, there's the added bonus of being able to rent a place with a fireplace perfect for those chilly winter nights.
Oh, Leo, you're such a romantic. But seriously, Canada does have a lot to offer when it comes to accommodation options. And let's not forget about the diversity of neighborhoods, from trendy areas like Gastown in Vancouver to historic districts like Old Montreal. Each one has its own unique character, and I'm sure our listeners would love to explore them.
Well, I'm sure they would. Mira, but have you considered the contrast between Canada's urban areas and its rural regions? In places like the Canadian Rockies, you'll find some of the most breathtaking natural scenery on the planet. And yet, the accommodation options can be quite limited, especially during peak season.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think that's what makes Canada so appealing to expats: the diversity of landscapes and cultures. From the bustling cities to the peaceful rural areas, there's something for everyone. And let's not forget about the friendly locals. Canadians are known for their hospitality. After all...
Yes, the famous Canadian politeness. But seriously, Mira, Canada does have a lot to offer when it comes to accommodation options. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that the quality of life is just so high in this country. But let's talk about something a bit more exotic: Tajikistan. For example.
Tajikistan? I'm not sure I've ever heard of that one, Leo. But I'm sure it's got its own unique charm. What's it like to rent a place there?
Well, Mira, let me tell you, Tajikistan's got a lot to offer when it comes to accommodation options. From traditional yurt camps to modern apartments in Dushanbe, the choices are endless. And let's not forget about the stunning natural scenery: the Pamir Mountains, for example, are just breathtaking.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about Tajikistan's accommodation options. And I'm curious, what's the cost like? Is it as affordable as Canada?
Well, Mira, it's a bit more complicated than that. While Tajikistan's not as expensive as Canada, the cost of living can vary greatly depending on the region and the type of accommodation you're looking for. But I'm sure our listeners would agree that the unique experiences and stunning natural scenery make it well worth the trip.
Absolutely. Leo. And I think that's what makes Tajikistan so appealing to expats, the adventure and the cultural experiences. From exploring the ancient city of Penjik to trekking through the Pamir Mountains. There's something for every type of adventurer.
Oh, yes. The Pamir Mountains, they're a real adventure waiting to happen. But seriously, Mira, Tajikistan does have a lot to offer when it comes to accommodation options. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the unique experiences and stunning natural scenery that this country has to offer.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would agree that both Canada and Tajikistan have their own unique charms when it comes to accommodation options and quality. But before we go, I have to ask, what's the best accommodation tip you've got for our listeners?
Well, Mira, I think the best tip I can offer is to be flexible whether you're renting in Canada or Tajikistan. Be prepared to adapt to new situations and cultures. And don't be afraid to try something new, whether it's a traditional yurt camp or a modern apartment in Dushanbe. There's always something new to discover.
Absolutely. Leo, and I think that's the key to making the most of your accommodation experience in either country. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate them. So, let's talk about the visa and immigration process in Canada and Tajikistan. I'm curious to know. Leo, have you ever tried to navigate the Canadian immigration system?
Well, Mira, I have, and I must say, it's a bit of a puzzle, but with the right guidance, it's manageable. I've heard that Canada has a reputation for being quite welcoming to immigrants, with a relatively straightforward process.
That's true. Leo, Canada's immigration process is indeed more streamlined than some other countries. But I think it's worth noting that the process can be lengthy, and it's essential to have a good understanding of the requirements and timelines.
Absolutely. Mira, I've seen cases where people have applied for a visa or permanent residency and waited months for a decision. But, as you said, having a solid grasp of the process can make all the difference.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Canada would agree with me. They know that the country's diversity and inclusive policies make it an attractive destination for expats. But what about Tajikistan? Leo, what's the situation like for foreigners trying to navigate the visa and immigration process there?
Tajikistan is a bit more complex. Mira, the country has a more restrictive immigration policy, and the process can be quite bureaucratic. However, I've heard that the government is working to simplify the process and make it more welcoming to foreign investors and tourists.
That's interesting. Leo, I've read that Tajikistan has a unique approach to immigration, with a focus on attracting foreign investment and tourism. But I'm sure our listeners are curious to know more about the practical aspects of the process.
Of course. Mira, let's talk about the requirements for a visa in Tajikistan. I've heard that it's quite challenging to get a visa on arrival, and most foreigners need to apply for a visa in advance.
That's right. Leo, the visa requirements for Tajikistan are quite strict, and it's essential to have all the necessary documents and paperwork in order. But I've also heard that the country has a relatively low cost of living, which can be a big draw for expats.
Yes. The cost of living in Tajikistan is indeed very low. Mira, and as you said, the country has a unique cultural landscape, with a mix of traditional and modern influences. But I'm curious to know, what about the official procedures in Canada? How do they compare to those in Tajikistan?
Well, Leo, the official procedures in Canada are generally more streamlined and efficient than those in Tajikistan. The country has a well-established system for processing visa applications and handling immigration cases.
That's true, Mira. Canada's immigration system is indeed more developed and efficient than Tajikistan's. But I think it's worth noting that both countries have their own unique challenges and requirements for foreigners.
Absolutely, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that understanding the visa and immigration process in both Canada and Tajikistan is essential for making informed decisions about their future.
Of course, Mira. Then, as we wrap up this segment, I'd like to ask our listeners, have you had any personal experiences with the visa and immigration process in either Canada or Tajikistan? Share your stories and tips with us in the comments.
That's a great idea, Leo. And as we move on to our next topic, I'd like to ask, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of the visa and immigration process in either country? All right, let's dive into 7. Access to and quality of health services for Canada and Tajikistan. I'm to share some insights with you all. Canada's healthcare system is known for its universal access, with a public healthcare plan that covers most medical services. From what I've researched, Canada's healthcare system is quite comprehensive, with a wide range of services available, including doctor visits, hospital stays, and even some dental and vision care.
That's true. Mira, Canada's healthcare system is indeed well regarded. However, when it comes to Tajikistan, the situation is a bit more complex. Tajikistan has a public healthcare system, but it's largely understaffed and underfunded. In fact, many rural areas in Tajikistan have limited access to healthcare services, making it difficult for people to receive proper medical care. But, on the other hand, Tajikistan has made significant strides in recent years to improve its healthcare system, including the establishment of a new national healthcare strategy.
That's a great point. Leo, I think it's interesting to note that both Canada and Tajikistan have their own unique challenges when it comes to healthcare. In Canada, one of the biggest challenges is the shortage of healthcare professionals, particularly in rural areas. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, the lack of infrastructure and resources is a major hurdle. But I'm curious, Leo, have you heard about the new hospital in Dushanbe, Tajikistan's capital city? I've heard it's a state-of-the-art facility with modern equipment and trained staff.
Ah, yes. I've heard about that hospital. It's indeed an impressive facility, and a major step forward for Tajikistan's healthcare system. However, I think it's worth noting that access to healthcare in Tajikistan is still a significant challenge, particularly for rural communities. In fact, many people in rural areas have to travel long distances to access basic healthcare services. But, on the other hand, Canada's healthcare system is designed to provide universal access to healthcare, regardless of where you live. I'm curious, Mira, have you heard about the Canada Health Act that sets out the principles for Canada's public health care system?
Yes. I've heard about the Canada Health Act. It's an important piece of legislation that sets out the principles for Canada's public health care system, including the principle of universal access and comprehensive coverage. But I think it's worth noting that while Canada's healthcare system is well regarded, it's not without its challenges. For example, there have been concerns about wait times for non-emergency procedures and the rising costs of healthcare. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, the lack of transparency and accountability in the healthcare system is a major concern.
That's a great point. Mira, transparency and accountability are essential for a functioning healthcare system. In Tajikistan, there have been efforts to improve transparency and accountability, including the establishment of a new healthcare monitoring system. But I think it's worth noting that cultural factors also play a significant role in shaping access to healthcare in Tajikistan. For example, traditional medicine is still widely practiced in Tajikistan, and many people may turn to traditional healers rather than seeking modern medical care.
That's a fascinating point. Leo, cultural factors can indeed play a significant role in shaping access to healthcare. In Canada, cultural factors also play a role, particularly for Indigenous communities who may have different healthcare needs and preferences. But I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have made efforts to improve access to healthcare for marginalized communities. For example, in Canada, there have been efforts to improve access to healthcare for Indigenous communities, including the establishment of new healthcare facilities and programs.
That's a great point. Mira, improving access to healthcare for marginalized communities is essential for a fair and equitable healthcare system. In Tajikistan, there have also been efforts to improve access to healthcare for marginalized communities, including the establishment of new healthcare facilities and programs. But I think it's worth noting that the quality of healthcare in Tajikistan is still a major concern. For example, many healthcare facilities in Tajikistan lack basic equipment and supplies, making it difficult for healthcare workers to provide high-quality care.
That's the great point. The quality of healthcare is indeed a major concern in Tajikistan, but I think it's worth noting that Canada's healthcare system is also not without its challenges. For example, there have been concerns about the quality of care in some hospitals, particularly in rural areas. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, the lack of healthcare professionals is a major challenge. In fact, many healthcare professionals in Tajikistan are not adequately trained or equipped to provide high-quality care.
That's a great point. Mira, the lack of healthcare professionals is indeed a major challenge in Tajikistan. But I think it's worth noting that Canada's healthcare system is designed to provide comprehensive coverage, including mental health services. In fact, Canada has a well-regarded mental health system, with a wide range of services available, including counseling and therapy. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, mental health services are still in the early stages of development.
That's a great point. Mental health services are indeed an important aspect of a comprehensive healthcare system. In Canada, mental health services are widely available, and many hospitals have dedicated mental health units. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, mental health services are still scarce, particularly in rural areas. But I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have made efforts to improve access to mental health services, including the establishment of new mental health facilities and programs.
That's a great point. Mira, improving access to mental health services is essential for a comprehensive healthcare system. In Tajikistan, there have been efforts to improve access to mental health services, including the establishment of new mental health facilities and programs. But I think it's worth noting that the stigma surrounding mental illness is still a major concern in Tajikistan. In fact, many people in Tajikistan may be reluctant to seek mental health care due to cultural or social stigma.
That's a great point. Leo, the stigma surrounding mental illness is indeed a major concern in Tajikistan. But I think it's worth noting that Canada's healthcare system is designed to provide confidential and non-judgmental care, including mental health services. In fact, many healthcare providers in Canada are trained to provide sensitive and compassionate care to patients with mental health issues. Meanwhile, in Tajikistan, the lack of confidentiality and non-judgmental care is a major concern.
That's a great point. Mira, confidentiality and non-judgmental care are essential for a comprehensive healthcare system. In Tajikistan, there have been efforts to improve access to confidential and non-judgmental care, including the establishment of new mental health facilities and programs. But I think it's worth noting that the quality of care in Tajikistan is still a major concern.
Welcome back to our podcast. Folks, today, we're comparing transportation infrastructure and convenience in Canada and Tajikistan. I'm Mira, and I'll be joined by Leo, who's an expert on all things transportation.
That's right. Mira, I'm to dive into the world of transportation with you. And what better way to start than with Canada's impressive public transit system?
Impressive, indeed. Canada's got some of the most efficient and reliable public transit systems in the world, from Toronto's TTC to Vancouver's SkyTrain. It's a dream for commuters. But, Leo, what about Tajikistan? How does its transportation infrastructure compare?
Well, Mira, Tajikistan's got its own set of challenges. The country's mountainous terrain makes road construction and maintenance a nightmare. But despite these challenges, the government has made significant investments in its transportation infrastructure.
That's fascinating. I bet our listeners in Tajikistan are nodding their heads in agreement right now. So, Leo, tell us more about Tajikistan's transportation landscape.
Sure thing. Mira, Tajikistan's got a well-developed road network, with many highways connecting major cities like Doshanbe and Khujan. And, with the help of international partners, the country is also investing in modernizing its public transportation system.
Wow, that's great to hear. I bet our listeners are curious about the best ways to get around Tajikistan. Leo, what's the most convenient way to travel around the country?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, while taxis and marshruts KS are popular options, I'd recommend using the country's bus network. It's a cheap and efficient way to get around, and you'll meet some fascinating people along the way.
I love that idea. Leo, and for our listeners who are planning a trip to Tajikistan, what's the best way to get around the country's rugged terrain?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, for the more adventurous types, I'd recommend taking a taxi or renting a 4x vehicle. But for those who prefer a more leisurely pace, there are many tour operators that offer guided treks and hikes.
That's a great tip. Leo, and for our listeners who are planning a trip to Canada, what's the best way to get around the country's vast territory?
Well, Mira, Canada's got a well-developed network of highways and public transportation systems. But for those who prefer a more scenic route, I'd recommend taking the train. It's a great way to see the country's stunning landscapes while relaxing in comfort.
That's a great idea. Leo, I bet our listeners are itching to hop on a train and explore Canada's beautiful countryside. So, Leo, what's the most convenient way to get around Canada's cities?
Ah, that's an easy one. Mira, Canada's got some of the best public transit systems in the world, from Toronto's TTC to Vancouver's SkyTrain. You'll find reliable and efficient transportation options in every major city.
I bet our listeners in Canada are nodding their heads in agreement right now. And for our listeners who are planning a trip to Tajikistan, what's the best way to navigate the country's bustling cities?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, while taxis and marshruts KS are popular options, I'd recommend using the country's bus network. It's a cheap and efficient way to get around, and you'll meet some fascinating people along the way.
I love that idea. And for our listeners who are planning a trip to Canada, what's the best way to get around the country's cities?
Well, Mira, Canada's got a well-developed network of public transportation systems. But for those who prefer a more scenic route, I'd recommend taking a bike or walking. It's a great way to explore the city's hidden gems while getting some exercise.
Ah, that's a great idea. Leo, I bet our listeners are itching to hop on a bike and explore Canada's vibrant cities. So, Leo, what's the most convenient way to get around Tajikistan's rural areas?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, for the more adventurous types, I'd recommend taking a taxi or renting a 4x vehicle. But for those who prefer a more leisurely pace, there are many tour operators that offer guided treks and hikes.
That's a great tip. Leo, and for our listeners who are planning a trip to Canada, what's the best way to get around the country's rural areas?
Well, Mira, Canada's got a well-developed network of highways and public transportation systems. But for those who prefer a more scenic route, I'd recommend taking the train. It's a great way to see the country's stunning landscapes while relaxing in comfort.
Ah, that's a great idea. Leo, I bet our listeners are itching to hop on a train and explore Canada's beautiful countryside. So, Leo, what's the most convenient way to get around Tajikistan's cities?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, while taxis and marshruts KS are popular options, I'd recommend using the country's bus network. It's a cheap and efficient way to get around, and you'll meet some fascinating people along the way.
I love that idea. Leo, and for our listeners who are planning a trip to Canada, What's the best way to get around the country's cities?
Well, Mira, Canada's got a well-developed network of public transportation systems. But for those who prefer a more scenic route, I'd recommend taking a bike or walk. It's a great way to explore the city's hidden gems while getting some exercise.
Ah, that's a great idea. Leo, I bet our listeners are itching to hop on a bike and explore Canada's vibrant cities. So, Leo, what's the most convenient way to get around Tajikistan?
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, for the more adventurous types, I'd recommend taking a taxi or renting a 4x4 vehicle. But for those who prefer a more leisurely pace, there are many tour operators that offer guided treks and hikes.
That's a great tip. Leo, and for our listeners who are planning a trip to Canada, what's the best way to get around the country's vast territory?
Well, Mira, Canada's got a well-developed network of highways and public transportation systems. But for those who prefer a more scenic route, I'd recommend taking the train. It's a great way to see the country's stunning landscapes while relaxing in comfort.
That's a great. So, let's dive into the fascinating world of language barriers and ease of communication in our two countries. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever had to navigate a language barrier in Canada, where French and English are both official languages?
Yes, I have. During a trip to Quebec, I got lost in a French-speaking neighborhood and couldn't understand a word anyone was saying. I kept pointing at signs and hoping for the best, but it was like trying to decipher hieroglyphics. Eventually, I found a friendly local who helped me out, but I was grateful for the language skills I do have.
I can imagine. I've had similar experiences in Quebec, but I've always managed to muddle through with my high school French. I'm curious to know, what do you think is the biggest language challenge for expats in Canada?
That's a great question. Mira, I think it's the nuances of French, especially in Quebec, where the accent and vocabulary can be quite different from what I learned in school. But overall, I'd say the language barrier is relatively low in Canada compared to some other countries.
I agree. Canada is generally very welcoming to international visitors and expats, and many Canadians speak multiple languages, including English, French, and other languages like Mandarin and Spanish. But have you ever encountered any cultural communication norms in Canada that were challenging to navigate?
Oh, yes. In some Indigenous communities, there are specific rules around communication, such as not speaking directly to elders or not using certain words or phrases. But I've also found that Canadians are generally very open and willing to learn about different cultures, which makes it easier to navigate these norms.
That's so true. Canadians are known for their politeness and willingness to listen. But let's move on to Tajikistan, where the language landscape is quite different. I'm curious. Leah, have you ever had to communicate in Tajik, the official language of the country?
Well, I have tried to learn some basic Tajik phrases, but I must admit, it's a challenging language to learn. However, I found that many Tajiks, especially younger people, speak some Russian or English, which makes communication easier.
That's great to hear. I've also heard that many Tajiks, especially in urban areas, are fluent in multiple languages, including Russian, English, and even Chinese. But have you ever encountered any language barriers in Tajikistan that were particularly challenging to overcome?
That's a good question. I think the biggest challenge is the lack of standardized language training in Tajikistan, which can lead to inconsistent language skills among different regions and communities. But overall, I'd say the language barrier is relatively low in Tajikistan, especially in urban areas.
I agree. Tajikistan is a country with a rich cultural heritage, and many Tajiks are proud of their language and culture. But I'm curious, what do you think is the most important aspect of language communication in Tajikistan?
I think it's the importance of respect and humility when communicating with locals. Many Tajiks place a high value on hospitality and respect for elders. which can be challenging for expats to navigate. But it's also a great opportunity to learn and grow.
That's so true. Respect and humility are essential when communicating with people from different cultures. And I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that language communication is key to building relationships and fostering cross-cultural understanding.
Absolutely. And I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the biggest challenge for expats in Tajikistan when it comes to language communication?
That's a great question. Leo, I think the biggest challenge is the lack of language resources and support for expats, especially those who are not fluent in Russian or Tajik. But overall, I'd say the language barrier is relatively low in Tajikistan, especially in urban areas.
That's a great point, Mira. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice or tips you have for navigating language barriers in Tajikistan.
Yes. One tip I give is to learn some basic Tajik phrases and to be respectful of local customs and traditions. And, of course, don't be afraid to ask for help or guidance when you need it.
Absolutely. And I'd like to add that learning a few key phrases in Tajik, such as salam and drama, can go a long way in building relationships with locals.
That's so true. I'm sure our listeners would agree with me that language communication is key to building relationships and fostering cross-cultural understanding. So, let's talk about cultural diversity and tolerance in Canada and Tajikistan. I'm curious. Leo, how do you think Canada's diverse population has contributed to its social harmony?
Well, Mira, Canada is indeed a mosaic of cultures, with over 20% of its population being foreign-born. This diversity has created a rich cultural landscape, with various festivals and celebrations throughout the year. I think it's great that Canada's government has implemented policies to promote diversity and inclusion, such as the Multiculturalism Act.
That's fascinating. Leo, and I think it's interesting that Canada's diversity is reflected in its cities, like Toronto, which is often called the most multicultural city in the world. But what about Tajikistan? How does its cultural diversity compare to Canada's?
Tajikistan is a fascinating case study. Mira, despite its small population, Tajikistan has a rich cultural heritage, with over 30 ethnic groups represented. However, I think it's worth noting that Tajikistan's cultural diversity is often overshadowed by its more dominant ethnic groups, such as the Tajiks and the Uzbeks.
I see what you mean. Leo, and I think it's great that you're highlighting the importance of acknowledging and respecting the cultural diversity of all ethnic groups. But what about social harmony initiatives in Tajikistan? How do they promote cultural diversity and tolerance?
Well, Mira, Tajikistan has implemented various initiatives to promote social harmony and cultural diversity, such as the National Action Plan for the Promotion of Tolerance and the Prevention of Extremism. These initiatives aim to promote interfaith dialogue and understanding, as well as to counter extremist ideologies.
That's really interesting. Leo, and I think it's great that you're highlighting the importance of interfaith dialogue and understanding. I'm sure our listeners would agree that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance is crucial for building a harmonious society. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I don't think it's wrong, Mira. But seriously, I think that both Canada and Tajikistan have made significant efforts to promote cultural diversity and tolerance. However, I think it's worth noting that there is still much work to be done in both countries to address issues of racism and xenophobia.
I completely agree. Leo, and I think it's great that you're highlighting the importance of addressing these issues. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think that cultural diversity and tolerance are more pronounced in Canada or Tajikistan? Let us know in the comments.
Well, Mira, I think that both countries have their own unique challenges and successes when it comes to cultural diversity and tolerance. But if I had to choose, I would say that Canada's multiculturalism has created a more inclusive and accepting society.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that its multiculturalism has also created a sense of belonging among its diverse population. I'm certain that our listeners living in Canada would agree with me.
I'm sure they would. Mira. But seriously, I think that both Canada and Tajikistan have much to learn from each other when it comes to promoting cultural diversity and tolerance. Perhaps we can explore more initiatives that both countries can implement to promote social harmony.
I think that's a great idea, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. So, let's wrap up this criterion by saying that cultural diversity and tolerance are essential components of a harmonious society. And we hope that our listeners will join us in promoting these values in their own communities.
Absolutely. Mira. And I think it's worth noting that promoting cultural diversity and tolerance requires a collective effort from individuals, communities, and governments. Let's all do our part to create a more inclusive and accepting society.
So, let's talk about Canada and its educational system. I'm sure many of our listeners would agree that Canada is known for its high-quality education, from elementary to post-secondary levels.
That's right, Mira. Canada has a strong reputation for its education system, with a focus on inclusivity and diversity. They have a wide range of educational institutions, from small colleges to large universities.
One of the things that stands out about Canada's education system is its emphasis on bilingualism. Many students learn both English and French, which is a unique aspect of Canadian education.
That's true. The bilingual system in Canada allows students to develop their language skills in both English and French, which is a valuable asset in today's globalized world.
I'm curious. Leo, have you ever visited a bilingual school in Canada? What was your experience like?
Actually, Mira, I have visited a bilingual school in Canada, and it was a fascinating experience. The students were able to switch between English and French seamlessly, which was impressive.
Well, that's amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that experience. Leo, can you tell us more about what you saw and what you learned?
Sure. Mira, the school had a unique approach to bilingual education, where students would learn in both languages throughout the day. It was a really immersive experience, and I was impressed by the students' language skills.
That sounds like an amazing experience. Leo, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. Leo, can you tell us more about the students you met and what you learned from them?
Well, Mira, I met some incredibly talented and motivated students who were eager to learn. They were from diverse backgrounds, and it was great to see them all working together in a bilingual environment.
I'm sure that was a really valuable experience for you. Leo? And speaking of valuable experiences, let's talk about Tajikistan's education system. What do you know about it? Leo?
Yes. Tajikistan's education system is quite different from Canada's, but it has its own unique strengths. The country has a strong focus on education, and many students attend school for free.
That's great to hear. Leo, I'm sure many of our listeners would be interested in learning more about Tajikistan's education system. Can you tell us more about it?
Sure. Mira, the education system in Tajikistan is based on a Soviet-style system, but it's been adapted to suit the country's needs. Many students attend school for free, and the government provides a lot of support for education.
Well, that's impressive. And speaking of impressive, let's talk about the educational opportunities in Canada. What do you think are some of the best educational opportunities in Canada? Leah?
That's a tough question. Mira, but one of the best educational opportunities in Canada is the country's strong focus on STEM education. Many universities in Canada offer top-notch programs in science, technology, engineering, and math.
That's great to hear. Leo, and speaking of great opportunities, let's talk about Tajikistan's language schools. What do you know about them? Leo?
Yes. The language schools in Tajikistan are quite unique. Many students attend language schools to learn Russian, which is a valuable skill in the country.
That's interesting. Leo, I'm sure many of our listeners would be interested in learning more about Tajikistan's language schools. Can you tell us more about them?
Sure. Mira, The language schools in Tajikistan are often attached to universities or other educational institutions, and they offer a range of language courses, including Russian, English, and other languages.
Well, that's impressive. And speaking of impressive, let's talk about the educational opportunities in Tajikistan. What do you think are some of the best educational opportunities in Tajikistan? Leo?
That's a tough question. Mira. But one of the best educational opportunities in Tajikistan is the country's strong focus on education for girls. Many organizations are working to improve education for girls in Tajikistan, which is a great initiative.
That's wonderful. Leo. And speaking of wonderful, let's talk about Canada's educational system. What do you think are some of the strengths of Canada's educational system? Leo?
That's an easy one. Mira, one of the strengths of Canada's educational system is its focus on inclusivity and diversity. The country has a strong reputation for welcoming students from all over the world.
That's great to hear. Leo, and speaking of great opportunities, let's talk about the language acquisition in Canada. What do you think are some of the best ways for students to learn a second language in Canada? Leo?
That's a great question. Mira, one of the best ways for students to learn a second language in Canada is through immersion programs, where students can live with a host family and learn the language in a real-world setting.
Wow, that's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of great ideas, let's talk about Tajikistan's educational system. What do you think are some of the challenges facing Tajikistan's educational system?
That's a tough question. Mira, but one of the challenges facing Tajikistan's educational system is the lack of resources and infrastructure. Many schools in Tajikistan lack basic necessities like textbooks and computers.
That's unfortunate. Leo, but I'm sure that many of our listeners would be interested in learning more about the educational opportunities in Tajikistan. Can you tell us more about the challenges facing the educational system in Tajikistan?
Sure. Mira, the challenges facing the educational system in Tajikistan are complex and multifaceted. But one of the biggest challenges is the lack of resources and infrastructure, which can make it difficult for students to access quality education.
Wow, that's a really important issue. Leo, and speaking of important issues, let's talk about the role of education in Canada. What do you think is the role of education in Canada? Leo?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the role of education in Canada is to provide students with the skills and knowledge they need to succeed in a rapidly changing world.
That's great. And speaking of great, let's talk about the educational opportunities in Tajikistan. What do you think are some of the ways that Tajikistan can improve its educational system? Leo?
That's a tough question. Mira, but one of the ways that Tajikistan can improve its educational system is by increasing access to quality education, particularly for girls and marginalized communities.
That's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of great ideas, let's talk about language acquisition in Tajikistan. What? I'm sure our listeners in Canada would agree that their country's climate is quite diverse, ranging from temperate to polar. From the Rocky Mountains to the coastlines, Canada's geography is perfect for experiencing different seasons.
Yes. And Tajikistan is no exception. It's a landlocked country in Central Asia, known for its rugged terrain and harsh climate. Temperatures can drop to 40 degrees Celsius in the winter, and the summers are hot and dry.
That's right. And I'm curious to know, Leo, how do the locals in Tajikistan adapt to such extreme temperatures? Do they have any unique ways of keeping warm or cool?
Well, Mira, in Tajikistan, people have developed some amazing ways to cope with the extreme temperatures. For example, they use traditional heating systems like the KHUD or KHWUD, which is a type of brick stove that's fueled by wood or coal.
That's fascinating, and I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. In Canada, we have a more moderate climate, but we still experience cold winters and hot summers. I'm sure our listeners would agree that having a cozy home is essential during the cold winter months.
Absolutely. Mira. And speaking of cozy homes, I've heard that in Tajikistan, people use traditional materials like woolen felt to insulate their homes. It's amazing to see how they've adapted to their environment and created their own unique solutions.
I'm curious to know, Leo, how do the people in Tajikistan deal with the lack of snow in the winter? I mean, we take snow for granted in Canada, but I'm sure it's a different story in Tajikistan.
Ah, that's a great question. Mira, in Tajikistan, people use alternative methods to get around during the winter months. For example, they use snow-free roads that are maintained by the government, and they also use horse-drawn carriages to get around.
Well, that's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. In Canada, we have a very different experience with snow. Of course, I'm sure our listeners would agree that driving in the snow can be quite challenging.
Indeed. Mira, and speaking of driving in the snow, I've heard that in Tajikistan, people use specialized vehicles that are designed for driving in snowy conditions. It's amazing to see how they've adapted to their environment and created their own unique solutions.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do they have any experiences with driving in snowy conditions or coping with extreme temperatures? Please share your stories in the comments.
I'm sure our listeners will have some hilarious stories to share. And speaking of hilarious stories, I've heard that in Tajikistan, people use humor to cope with the extreme temperatures. For example, they have a saying that goes, if you don't like the weather in Tajikistan, just wait 5 minutes.
Ah, that's the great one. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about it. In Canada, we also use humor to cope with the weather. Of course. I mean, who can forget the classic Canadian joke, sorry? Eh?
Oh, yes, that's a good one. Mira. And speaking of apologies, I've heard that in Tajikistan, people use traditional apologies to cope with the harsh climate. For example, they use the phrase Tashkun, which means I'm sorry in Tajik.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about it. In Canada, we also use traditional apologies. Of course. I mean, who can forget the classic Canadian phrase, I'm sorry? Buddy?
Ah, yes. That's a good one. Mira. And speaking of apologies, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. But before we wrap up, I have one more question. What do you think our listeners would say is the most challenging part of living in a country with extreme temperatures?
Ah, that's a great question. Leo. And I think our listeners would agree that it's the unpredictability of the weather that's the most challenging part. I mean, who can predict a snowstorm or a heat wave?
Absolutely. Mira. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you for chatting with me today about climate and seasonal conditions in Canada and Tajikistan. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you, Leo, for sharing your insights about Tajikistan's climate. It's been a real eye-opener for me, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate it. And so to dive into the world of Canadian cuisine, which is all about embracing diverse flavors and ingredients. From coast to coast, you'll find a rich tapestry of culinary traditions that reflect the country's cultural melting pot. And I'm curious, Leo, what's the first dish that comes to mind when you think of Canada?
Ah, Mira. You know I'm a sucker for a good pun. But in all seriousness, Canadian cuisine has come a long way from its humble beginnings as a fusion of French, British, and indigenous flavors. Today, you can find everything from modern twists on classic dishes to innovative uses of local ingredients like maple syrup and bison.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the incredible diversity of food in Canada. From the vibrant food scenes in cities like Toronto and Vancouver to the rich culinary traditions of indigenous communities. I mean, have you ever tried bannock? Leo? It's a traditional indigenous bread that's perfect for snacking on the go.
Actually, Mira, I have tried bannock, and it's amazing. But I'm also curious about the unique ingredients that Canada has to offer. I've heard that the country is home to some of the world's best salmon, and that the waters off the coast of British Columbia are teeming with wild seafood.
That's right. Leo! And speaking of seafood, have you ever tried a good plate of fish and chips? It's a classic Canadian dish that's both comforting and delicious. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Canadian culture, particularly when it comes to celebrating special occasions like Christmas and Thanksgiving.
Ah, yes. Canadian Christmas dinner is a big deal, and it typically features a roasted turkey or ham, along with all the trimmings like mashed potatoes and stuffing. But I've also heard that some Canadian families have their own unique traditions, like serving tortilla. Uh, Traditional Quebecois meat pie.
That sounds amazing. Leo, and I'm curious about the impact of food culture on Canadian society, particularly when it comes to issues like food security and sustainability. I mean, have you heard about the initiatives in Vancouver that are working to reduce food waste and promote locally sourced ingredients?
Actually, Mira, I have heard about those initiatives, and they're really inspiring. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Canadian culture when it comes to social justice and activism. I've heard that food can be a powerful tool for building community and promoting social change.
Exactly. Leo, and speaking of social justice, I'm curious about the impact of food culture on Indigenous communities in Canada. I mean, have you heard about the efforts to revitalize traditional Indigenous cuisine and to promote food sovereignty?
Yes, Mira, and that's a really important topic. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Canadian culture when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship. I've heard that Canada is home to a thriving food startup scene, with companies like Fresh Ayana Low Fresh offering healthy and sustainable food options.
That's right. Leo, and speaking of innovation, I'm curious about the use of technology in Canadian food culture. I mean, have you heard about the initiatives that are using data analytics and machine learning to optimize food production and reduce food waste?
Actually, Mira, I've heard about those initiatives, and they're really fascinating. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Canadian culture when it comes to tourism and travel. I mean, have you heard about the food tours that are popular in cities like Montreal and Toronto?
Yes. Leo, and that's a great point. But I'm also curious about the impact of food culture on Canadian identity and national pride. I mean, have you heard about the efforts to promote Canadian cuisine and ingredients on the national stage?
Yes. Mira! And that's a really important topic. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Canadian culture when it comes to cultural exchange and diplomacy. I mean, have you heard about the initiatives that are promoting Canadian cuisine and culture abroad?
That's right. Leo, and speaking of cultural exchange, I'm curious about the similarities and differences between Canadian and Tajik cuisine. I mean, have you ever tried a traditional Tajik dish like pialovi or shirpa?
Actually, Mira, I have tried PLOV, and it's amazing. But I'm also curious about the unique ingredients and cooking techniques that are used in Tajik cuisine. I mean, have you heard about the use of saffron and spices in traditional Tajik dishes?
Yes. Yeah, and that's a great point. But I'm also curious about the impact of food culture on Tajik society, particularly when it comes to issues like food security and sustainability. I mean, have you heard about the initiatives in Tajikistan that are working to promote locally sourced ingredients and reduce food waste?
Actually, Mira, I have heard about those initiatives, and they're really inspiring. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Tajik culture when it comes to social justice and activism. I mean, have you heard about the efforts to promote food sovereignty in traditional Tajik cuisine?
Yes. Leo! And speaking of social justice, I'm curious about the impact of food culture on indigenous communities in Tajikistan. I mean, have you heard about the efforts to revitalize traditional indigenous cuisine and promote food sovereignty?
Yes. Mira, and that's a really important topic. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Tajik culture when it comes to innovation and entrepreneurship. I mean, have you heard about the food startups that are emerging in Tajikistan?
Actually, Leo, I have heard about those startups, and they're really exciting. But I'm also curious about the use of technology in Tajik food culture. I mean, have you heard about the initiatives that are using data analytics and machine learning to optimize food production and reduce food waste?
Ah, yes. Mira, and that's a great point. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Tajik culture when it comes to tourism and travel. I mean, have you heard about the food tours that are popular in cities like Doshanbe and Ujjain?
Oh, yes. Leo. And that's a great point. But I'm also curious about the impact of food culture on Tajik identity and national pride. I mean, have you heard about the efforts to promote Tajik cuisine and ingredients on the national stage?
Ah, yes, Mira. And that's a really important topic. But I'm also curious about the role of food in Tajik culture when it comes to cultural exchange and diplomacy. I mean, have you heard about the initiatives that are promoting Tajik cuisine and culture abroad?
That's right. Leo. And speaking of cultural exchange, I'm curious about the ways in which Canadian and Tajik cuisine intersect. I mean, had you ever tried it? So, let's dive into the rich historical and cultural heritage of Canada and Tajikistan. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever visited Canada? What was your impression of its historic sites?
Oh, yes, I have. I visited the iconic CNR in Toronto, and it was an incredible experience. The views from the top were breathtaking, and I was amazed by the diversity of the city's cultural scene.
That sounds amazing. Canada has a lot to offer when it comes to history and culture. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about its museums, like the Canadian Museum of History. Do you have a favorite exhibit? Leo?
Actually, I did visit the Canadian Museum of History, and one of the exhibits that caught my attention was the one on the history of the First Nations. It was fascinating to learn about the rich cultural heritage of the Indigenous people of Canada.
That's a great point. Leo, the First Nations have a deep history in Canada, and it's essential to recognize and respect their culture. Speaking of respect, I'm sure our listeners would agree that Tajikistan has a unique cultural identity shaped by its Central Asian heritage.
Absolutely. Tajikistan has a rich cultural history, with a blend of Persian, Arabic, and Russian influences. The country's architecture, music, and art are all reflections of its diverse cultural heritage.
That's so true. Leo, Tajikistan's cultural landscape is a fascinating blend of traditional and modern elements. I'm curious, have you ever tried traditional Tajik food, like PLOV or Sherpa?
Yes, I have. In fact, I tried it during my visit to Doshanbe, the capital city. The flavors were amazing, and I loved the hospitality of the people I met.
That's wonderful. Leo, food is a great way to connect with the culture, and Tajik cuisine is definitely worth trying. Now, let's talk about the artistic values of both countries. What are your thoughts on Canada's vibrant art scene?
Canada has a thriving art scene, with a wide range of galleries and museums showcasing local and international artists. The country's support for the arts is evident in its many festivals and events, like the Toronto International Film Festival.
That's great to hear. Leo, Canada's art scene is indeed thriving. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about Tajikistan's traditional art forms, like the Suzanai embroidery or the Kamai pottery.
Ah, yes. Tajikistan's traditional art forms are truly unique and beautiful. The Suzanai embroidery, in particular, is a masterpiece of textile art, with intricate patterns and designs that tell stories of the country's history and culture.
That's a great point. Leo, the Suzanai embroidery is a testament to Tajikistan's rich cultural heritage. As we conclude this criterion, I'd like to thank Jitoff, AI for supporting our podcast and helping us uncover the rich historical and cultural heritage of Canada and Tajikistan.
Thank you. Mira, it's been a pleasure discussing the historical, cultural, and artistic values of these two fascinating countries.
Canada's diverse landscape is like a postcard come to life, with towering mountains, serene lakes, and vast forests. I mean, Have you seen the Rocky Mountains? They're like nature's skyscrapers.
Ah, yes. But have you seen the Pamir Mountains in Tajikistan? They're like the Himalayas on steroids. The highest peak is Amal Somoni Peak. Reaches an astonishing 495 meters. That's like climbing Mount Everest and then some.
Well, that's intense. But I bet the views from the top are breathtaking. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear about the trekking routes and scenic trails in Tajikistan. Do you have any insider tips? Leo?
Well, I can tell you that the trek to the Pamir Mountains is not for the faint of heart. It's a real adventure, with unpredictable weather and steep terrain. But if you're up for the challenge, the scenery is simply stunning. And don't even get me started on the traditional Tajik hospitality. You'll be treated like royalty.
That sounds amazing. I'm sure our listeners would love to experience it for themselves. And speaking of experiencing nature, Canada has some of the most beautiful national parks in the world. National Park. Anyone? It's like a fairy tale come true.
Ah, yes. But have you seen the Fan Mountains in Tajikistan? They're like a lesser-known version of the Swiss Alps. The scenery is just as breathtaking, with towering peaks, pristine lakes, and picturesque villages. And don't even get me started on the local cuisine. You'll be spoiled for choice.
Spoiled for choice. Indeed. I'm sure our listeners would love to try some of the local specialties in Tajikistan. And speaking of food, have you tried pad thai in Canada? It's like a culinary masterpiece: fries, cheese curds, and gravy all in one.
Ah, yes. But have you tried the traditional Tajik dish, PLOV? It's like a fusion of Middle Eastern and Central Asian cuisine. You'll be hooked. And don't even get me started on the local markets. You can find everything from fresh produce to handmade crafts.
That sounds like a shopper's paradise. I'm sure our listeners would love to explore the markets in Tajikistan. And speaking of exploration, Canada has some of the most beautiful coastlines in the world. The Bay of Fundy. Anyone? It's like a natural wonder, the highest tides in the world.
Ah, yes. But have you seen the Sari Kamish Lake in Tajikistan? It's like a hidden gem of stunning saltwater lake surrounded by towering mountains. And don't even get me started on the local wildlife. You'll spot everything from snow leopards to brown bears.
Well, that sounds like a real-life National Geographic special. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the wildlife in Tajikistan. And speaking of wildlife, Canada has some of the most incredible national parks in the world. Jasper National Park. Anyone? It's like a real-life fairy tale: grizzly bears, wolves, and elk roaming free.
Ah, yes. But have you seen the Norkay Reservoir in Tajikistan? It's like a massive turquoise lake surrounded by towering mountains. And don't even get me started on the local traditions. You'll be treated to a real-life cultural experience.
That sounds like an incredible experience. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the local traditions in Tajikistan. And speaking of traditions, Canada has some of the most beautiful and unique festivals in the world. The Calgary Stampede. Anyone? It's like a real-life cowboy show: rodeos, music, and food galore.
Ah, yes. But have you seen the traditional Tajik festival? Now you see. It's like a real-life celebration of spring music, dance, and food galore. And don't even get me started on the local handicrafts. You'll be spoiled for choice.
That sounds like a real-life cultural explosion. I'm sure our listeners would love to experience that for themselves. And speaking of experiencing nature, Canada has some of the most beautiful national parks in the world. Personal National Park. Anyone? It's like a real-life geological wonder: towering cliffs, pristine lakes, and scenic trails galore.
Ah, yes. But have you seen the KUA Chaikai in Tajikistan? It's like a lesser-known version of the Grand Canyon. The scenery is just as breathtaking, with towering cliffs, pristine lakes, and scenic trails galore. And don't even get me started on the local cuisine. You'll be spoiled for choice.
I'm loving the idea of exploring sports and adventure options in Canada and Tajikistan. Who's up for some hockey and mountain climbing?
Sounds like you're ready for a thrill ride. Mira, Canada's got some of the best hockey leagues in the world, and Tajikistan's mountains offer some of the most breathtaking scenery on the planet.
Exactly. I'm sure our listeners living in Canada would agree that the Great White North is a paradise for hockey fans, and for those who love adventure. The Rocky Mountains offer endless opportunities for hiking, skiing, and mountain climbing.
That's right. But Tajikistan's also got its own unique set of adventure sports, like rock climbing in the Fan Mountains or paragliding in the Tammers. And let's not forget about the country's rich skiing heritage.
Oh, I'm so down for some paragliding in the Pamirs. I can just imagine the breathtaking views from up high. And have you ever tried skiing in the Fan Mountains? Leah?
Actually, I have. It's a whole different experience from skiing in the Rockies. That's for sure. The terrain is more rugged, and the scenery is just stunning.
I bet. I'm curious. What do you think is the biggest difference between Canada's and Tajikistan's adventure sports scenes?
That's a tough one. But I think it's the level of infrastructure. Canada's got a well-established tourism industry, with plenty of resources and guides available for adventure seekers. Tajikistan's still developing its infrastructure, so it's more of a roughing it kind of experience.
That's a great point, Leo. But I think that's part of the charm, right? The raw, untamed beauty of Tajikistan's mountains and landscapes is just irresistible.
Absolutely. And the people, too. Tajikistanis are some of the friendliest and most welcoming people I've ever met.
I'm sure our listeners would agree. So, what do you think is the most popular adventure sport in Tajikistan?
Well, I think it's got to be hiking. The country's got some of the most beautiful and remote hiking trails in the world, and the scenery is just breathtaking.
That's so cool. I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. If you've ever hiked in Tajikistan, share your experiences in the comments below.
And don't forget to check out the local guide services. Mira, they're some of the best in the world, and they'll help you navigate the trails and make the most of your adventure.
Great tip. Leo! And speaking of tips, I've got one for our listeners. If you're planning to hike in the Fan Mountains, make sure to pack layers and waterproof gear. The weather can be unpredictable, and you don't want to get caught in a sudden storm.
Good advice. Mira! And don't forget to bring your sense of humor. Too. The locals will appreciate it, and you'll have a much more enjoyable experience.
Thanks for the tip, Leo. And to all our listeners out there, don't forget to follow us on social media for more adventure tips and recommendations. We've got a whole series of podcasts on outdoor activities and adventure sports, so be sure to check them out.
And if you've got any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us on social media or in the comments below. We love hearing from our listeners and getting their feedback.
It's broadcast. Folks, thanks for tuning in and joining the conversation. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more exciting content on Canada and Tajikistan.
And until next time, stay adventurous and keep exploring.
And so to talk about nightlife and entertainment in Canada, our first country. Who here has been to a Canadian music festival? I've heard they're epic.
I've been to a few. And let me tell you, they're not just epic. They're also ridiculously cold. But seriously, Canada has an amazing music scene. From jazz to rock to indie. They've got it all.
Exactly. And have you heard about the Toronto International Film Festival? It's like a movie lover's paradise.
Yeah, I've been to a few film festivals. But Toronto's is one of the biggest and best. I mean, who wouldn't want to see the latest blockbusters on the big screen?
But it's not just about the movies. Canada has a thriving theatre scene as well. From Shakespearean plays to modern musicals. There's something for everyone.
And let's not forget about the comedy scene. Canadian comedians like Jim Carrey and Howie Mandel have made it big in the States.
That's true. But I'm sure our listeners living in Canada would agree that there's more to nightlife than just comedy clubs. What about you? Leah? Have you explored Canada's nightlife scene?
Well, I've had my fair share of pouting and hockey games, but I'm more of a city boy. So, I stick to the big cities like Toronto and Vancouver.
Oh, I see. And have you heard about the famous Bourbon Street in Montreal? It's like a mini New Orleans in the heart of Canada.
Yeah, I've been there, and it's definitely a party. But seriously, Canada has a great balance between urban and rural nightlife. You can find anything from a quaint pub to a massive rave.
That's so true. And speaking of raves, have you heard about the famous music festivals in Quebec? They're like a mini Eurovision on the dance floor.
Yeah, I've heard of those. But in all seriousness, Canada's nightlife scene is incredibly diverse. From the maritime provinces to the prairies, each region has its own unique flavor.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about Canada's nightlife scene. Do you think it's more laid back or party-oriented?
That's a great question. I think it's a bit of both. Canadians are known for being friendly and welcoming, but they also know how to party hard.
That's so true. And speaking of partying, let's move on to our second country, Tajikistan. Have you been to a Tajikistan music festival?
Actually, I have. And let me tell you, it was an experience unlike any other. The music, the food, the culture. It was all so unique and fascinating.
Wow, that sounds amazing. I've heard that Tajikistan has a rich cultural heritage, with influences from both Persian and Russian traditions.
Exactly. And that's reflected in their music and dance as well. From traditional folk songs to modern pop, there's a lot of creativity and experimentation going on.
I've heard that Tajikistan also has a thriving art scene, with many galleries and museums showcasing local and international art.
Yeah, that's true. And the city of Dushanbe is particularly known for its beautiful architecture and vibrant cultural scene.
Oh, I see. And have you heard about the famous Registan Square in Dushanbe? It's like a mini Registan in Samarkand.
Yeah, I've been there, and it's definitely a stunning sight. But seriously, Tajikistan has a lot to offer when it comes to nightlife and entertainment.
That's so true. And speaking of Registan, I'm curious about what our listeners think about Tajikistan's cultural heritage. Do you think it's more Persian or Russian influenced?
That's a great question. I think it's a bit of both, but with a unique twist that's all its own. Tajikistan's culture is like a delicious blend of spices that's both familiar and exotic.
That's so true. And speaking of spices, let's wrap up our conversation on nightlife and entertainment in Tajikistan. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
And thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts on Canada and Tajikistan's nightlife scenes in the comments below.
So, let's talk about family-friendly environments and children's activities in Canada and Tajikistan. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever visited either of these countries with your family?
Actually, I've been to Canada a few times, but not with kids. I remember it was a great place for families, though lots of parks and playgrounds. But Tajikistan? Never been. But I've heard it's a hidden gem for outdoor enthusiasts.
That's right. And speaking of outdoor enthusiasts, Canada has some amazing national parks, like Banff and Jasper. Have you ever hiked the Rockies? Leo?
No. It's kind of like I say where it's at. I've stuck to city life, but I've heard great things about those parks. In Tajikistan, though, I've heard the Pamir Mountains are a must-see for trekkers and nature lovers.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of nature, I'm sure our listeners would love to know about some of the amazing family-friendly activities in Tajikistan. Leo, what do you think about the idea of horseback riding through the mountains with kids?
Oh, that sounds like a blast. And I'm sure the kids will love the scenery. But I've also heard that Tajikistan has a great tradition of storytelling and folk music. Have you ever heard of the Tajik folk song, Sosoniba?
Actually, I have. It's a beautiful traditional song, and I'm sure our listeners would love to learn more about it. And speaking of music, Canada has a thriving music scene, especially in cities like Toronto and Vancouver.
That's true. But in Tajikistan, I've heard that music and dance are a big part of the culture, especially during traditional festivals like Nowruz. Have you ever been to a Nowruz celebration, Mira?
No, but I've heard it's a wonderful experience. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the different cultural traditions in Canada and Tajikistan. Leo, what do you think about the idea of trying traditional foods with kids?
That's a great idea. In Canada, we have a lot of great food options. But in Tajikistan, I've heard that the traditional dishes like PLOV and shirpa are delicious and kid-friendly. And have you ever tried a traditional Canadian dish like Pao Tan? Mira?
Yes, I have. And it's delicious. But I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the unique cultural traditions in Tajikistan, like the traditional wedding ceremonies.
That's true. And speaking of weddings, I've heard that in Canada, there are many great family-friendly activities and events during the summer months, like outdoor festivals and concerts.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the amazing family-friendly museums in Canada, like the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau.
That's a great idea, Mira. And in Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great museums and cultural centers that offer family-friendly activities and exhibits.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the unique cultural traditions in both countries. Leo, what do you think about the idea of visiting a traditional Canadian powwow with kids?
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm sure the kids would love the music and dancing. In Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly festivals and events throughout the year, like the Tajikistan International Film Festival.
That's true. And speaking of film, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the amazing family-friendly films that have been made in Canada, like the animated film The Gruffalo.
That's a great choice, Mira. And in Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly films that have been made in the country, like the film Tajikistan Land of the Mountains.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the amazing family-friendly activities and traditions in both countries. Leo, what do you think about the idea of visiting a traditional Tajikistan yurt with kids?
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm sure the kids would love the unique cultural experience. In Canada, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly activities and events during the winter months, like skiing and ice skating.
Exactly. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the amazing family-friendly museums in Canada, like the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia.
That's a great idea, Mira. And in Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly museums and cultural centers that offer a unique glimpse into the country's rich cultural heritage.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the unique cultural traditions in both countries. Leo, what do you think about the idea of trying traditional Canadian winter sports with kids?
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm sure the kids would love the excitement of trying new sports like ice hockey and skiing. In Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly activities and events during the winter months, like horse-drawn sleigh rides.
That's true. And speaking of winter sports, I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the amazing family-friendly ski resorts in Canada, like Whistler Blackcomb.
That's a great choice, Mira. And in Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly ski resorts and snowboarding areas, like the Saras Lake Ski Resort.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the amazing family-friendly activities and traditions in both countries. Leo, what do you think about the idea of visiting a traditional Canadian Native American reserve with kids?
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm sure the kids would love the unique cultural experience. In Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly cultural centers and museums that offer a glimpse into the country's rich cultural heritage.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the amazing family-friendly activities and events in Canada, like the Canada Day celebrations.
That's a great idea, Mira. And in Tajikistan, I've heard that there are many great family-friendly events and festivals throughout the year, like the Tajikistan International Music Festival.
I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about some of the unique cultural traditions in both countries. Leo, What do you think about the idea of trying traditional Tajikistan food with kids?
Oh, that sounds like a great idea. And I'm sure the kids would love the unique flavors and spices of traditional Tajikistan cuisine. In Canada, I've heard that there are many great family.
I'm so to dive into the LGBT-friendly atmosphere in Canada and Tajikistan as we explore the rainbow. I'm curious to know, Leo, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Canadian pride?
Ah, Mira, Canada is a leader in pride parades and events. From the iconic Vancouver Pride Parade to the massive Toronto Pride Festival, it's a country that truly celebrates diversity. And I'm not just talking about the rainbow flags flying high. I'm talking about the inclusivity and acceptance that permeates every aspect of Canadian society.
That's so true. Leo, I've had the chance to attend a few Pride events in Canada, and it's incredible to see how the community comes together to celebrate love and acceptance. But I have to ask, what about Tajikistan? How does it compare to Canada in terms of LGBT friendliness?
Well, Mira, Tajikistan is a country with a complex history when it comes to LGBT rights. While there are some small steps being taken towards greater inclusivity, it's still a long way from being a welcoming place for the LGBT community. But, as we all know, progress is slow, and it's up to us to keep pushing for change.
I completely agree. Leo, and it's interesting to note that both countries have their own unique cultural and historical contexts that shape their attitudes towards LGBT issues. But, as we explore these differences, I want to ask our listeners, what do you think is the most important factor in creating an LGBT-friendly atmosphere in a country?
Ah, great question. Mira, I think it's all about education and awareness. When people understand and accept the diversity of the LGBT community, it creates a ripple effect of inclusivity that spreads throughout the country. And, of course, having strong legal protections and laws in place is crucial. But education and awareness are key.
That's so true. Leo, and it's amazing to see how Canada has been a leader in this area, with its comprehensive hate, crime laws and robust education programs. But what about Tajikistan? How can we support the LGBT community there in their efforts to create a more inclusive atmosphere?
Well, Mira, I think it's all about supporting grassroots initiatives and organizations that are working to create positive change. Whether it's through fundraising, advocacy, or education, every little bit counts. And it's essential to support the efforts of those on the ground.
I completely agree. Leo, and it's heartening to see that even in the face of adversity, the LGBT community in Tajikistan is finding ways to resist and fight for their rights. But, as we wrap up this topic, I want to ask our listeners, what do you think is the most important takeaway from our discussion today?
Ah, great question. Mira, I think it's that even in the face of adversity, there is always hope for change. And, as we continue to push for greater inclusivity and acceptance, it's essential to remember that every small step counts, and every voice matters.
I love that. Leah, and I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with you today. As we move on to our next topic, I want to ask our listeners, what do you think is the most important factor in creating an LGBT-friendly atmosphere in a country? Let us know in the comments below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more content like this.
Canada is renowned for its warm hospitality, with a culture that welcomes foreigners with open arms. From the moment you step off the plane, you'll feel at home.
That's true. But what about the stereotype that Canadians are too polite? Don't they sometimes come across as a bit, well, boring?
Boring? Never. Canadians are just naturally friendly and courteous. They'll often go out of their way to help you, even if it means sacrificing their own time.
I see what you mean. I was in Vancouver once, and the locals were so friendly that I felt like I was part of the community. But what about the Indigenous people? Don't they have a different perspective on hospitality?
Absolutely. The Indigenous people have a rich cultural heritage that's deeply rooted in their land and traditions. They have a unique approach to hospitality that's based on mutual respect and reciprocity.
That's fascinating. I've heard that the indigenous people in Canada have a concept called Mitakoda, which means welcome or friendship. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, Mitakoda is a fundamental aspect of Indigenous hospitality. It's about creating a sense of belonging and connection with others, and it's often expressed through shared meals and songs.
I can see how that would be a powerful way to build relationships. But what about Tajikistan? How do they approach hospitality?
Well, Tajikistan is a country with a rich cultural heritage, and their hospitality is deeply rooted in their Islamic traditions. They place a strong emphasis on respect, generosity, and kindness towards guests.
That's interesting. I've heard that in Tajikistan, hospitality is often expressed through the concept of kana, which means house or home. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, kana is a fundamental aspect of Tajik hospitality. It's about creating a sense of warmth and welcome in the home, and it's often expressed through shared meals, tea, and conversation.
I see what you mean. In Canada, the emphasis is on individualism and personal space, whereas in Tajikistan, the emphasis is on community and shared space. That's a fascinating contrast.
Exactly. And it's not just about the physical space, but also about the cultural norms and values that underlie it. In Canada, for example, there's a strong emphasis on independence and self-reliance, whereas in Tajikistan, there's a strong emphasis on interdependence and community.
I'm curious. Mira, what do you think is the key to building strong relationships with locals in both Canada and Tajikistan?
Well, I think it's all about being open-minded, respectful, and willing to learn from others. Whether you're in Canada or Tajikistan, the locals will appreciate your genuine interest in their culture and traditions.
That makes sense. And what about language? How important is it to learn the local language when visiting either country?
That's a great question. While it's not always necessary to learn the local language, it's definitely a plus when interacting with locals. In Canada, for example, many people speak English, but learning some French or indigenous languages can go a long way in building relationships.
I see what you mean. In Tajikistan, the official language is Tajik, but many people also speak Russian and English. What about our listeners living in these countries? Do they have any advice for newcomers?
I'm sure they would. Let's hear from them in the comments section. Maybe we can even get some insider tips on how to navigate the local culture.
Sounds like a great idea. Mira, and finally, what do you think is the most important thing to remember when visiting either Canada or Tajikistan?
Well, I think it's all about being respectful and open-minded. Whether you're in a bustling city or a rural village, the locals will appreciate your genuine interest in their culture and traditions.
That's a great note to end on. Mira, and to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this journey through the world of hospitality and attitudes towards foreigners in Canada and Tajikistan.
I'm curious about the internet infrastructure in Canada. They have such a vast and diverse geography. Yet it's amazing to see how they've managed to cover the entire country with a reliable internet connection.
That's true. But have you seen the prices for internet plans in Canada? They're through the roof. I'm sure our listeners who live in Canada would agree that it's a luxury to have a decent internet connection at an affordable price.
I see what you mean. But I think it's worth it for the quality of service. In fact, Canada has one of the highest speeds in the world, with an average download speed of over 50 Mbps. That's impressive, don't you think?
Yeah, But what about the rural areas? I've heard that internet connectivity in rural Canada can be quite patchy. I'm sure our listeners from rural areas would agree that it's a challenge to get a reliable internet connection.
That's a great point. Leo, Canada has been investing heavily in rural internet infrastructure, including a roll out of fiber optic cables and satellite internet. It's a big step forward for those living in rural areas.
I'm curious. Nira, have you ever tried to get an internet connection set up in a rural area? I've heard it's a real challenge, even for tech-savvy people like ourselves.
Actually, Leo, I have tried to set up an internet connection in a rural area, and it was a bit of a nightmare. but I managed to get it sorted out with the help of a local expert.
Wow, that's impressive. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about your experience. Maybe you can share some tips on how to get a reliable internet connection in a rural area.
Sure thing. Leah, I'd be happy to share my experience. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate any advice or tips they can get on how to navigate the world of internet connectivity in rural Canada.
That's a great idea. Mira, and speaking of rural areas, I've heard that Tajikistan has some of the most beautiful and remote landscapes in the world. Have you ever been to Tajikistan? Mira?
Actually, Leah, I have been to Tajikistan, and it was an incredible experience. The scenery is breathtaking, and the people are so warm and welcoming.
I'm jealous. Mira, I'd love to visit Tajikistan one day. But I'm sure our listeners would be interested to know more about the internet infrastructure in Tajikistan.
Yes. The internet infrastructure in Tajikistan is quite different from Canada's, to say the least. In fact, Tajikistan has one of the lowest internet penetration rates in the world, with only about 20% of the population having access to the internet.
Wow, that's a big gap. But I've heard that the government of Tajikistan is working to improve internet connectivity, especially in rural areas.
Leah, the government has been investing in fiber optic cables and satellite internet to bring high-speed internet to more areas of the country.
I'm curious. Mira, how does the internet infrastructure in Tajikistan compare to Canada's in terms of speed and accessibility?
Well, Leah, the speeds in Tajikistan are much slower than in Canada, and the availability of internet services is limited in rural areas. However, the government is working to improve the situation.
I see. And what about digital nomads? Mira, would they find it easy to get a reliable internet connection in Tajikistan?
Actually, Leo, digital nomads might find it challenging to get a reliable internet connection in Tajikistan, especially in rural areas. But there are some internet cafes and co-working spaces in cities like Dushanbe that offer decent internet connectivity.
That's good to know. Mira, and finally, I'm curious to know, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing internet infrastructure in both Canada and Tajikistan?
That's a tough question. But I think one of the biggest challenges facing internet infrastructure in both countries is the digital divide, especially in rural areas.
I agree with you. Mira, the digital divide is a major challenge facing internet infrastructure in many countries, including Canada and Tajikistan. But I think it's great that both countries are working to improve internet connectivity and accessibility.
Absolutely, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would agree that it's essential to have reliable internet connectivity in today's digital age.
That's all for this criterion. Folks, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.
So, let's talk about shopping opportunities in Canada, shall we? I mean, who doesn't love a good shopping spree? From trendy boutiques to massive malls, Canada has got it all.
And it's not just about the quantity. Mira, the quality is also top-notch. I mean, have you seen the prices of designer brands in Canada? They're almost as high as the mountains.
Oh, Leo, you're such a jokester. But seriously, the prices might be steep, but the quality is definitely worth it. I mean, who wants to buy a cheap knockoff when you can get the real deal?
Exactly. And speaking of knockoffs, have you ever been to a market in Tajikistan? I went to one in Dushanbe. It was like a treasure trove of knockoffs. I mean, I saw a fake Louis Vuitton bag for like $5.
Oh, Leo, you're such a sucker for a good deal. But seriously, I'm curious, how did you find the quality of the knockoffs?
Well, let's just say I won't be wearing it to any high-end events anytime soon. But it's funny, because the vendor was trying to convince me that it was the real deal. I mean, I've seen some convincing fake designs in my time, but this one took the cake.
Oh, Leo, you're such a character. But seriously, I think we're getting a bit off track here. Let's talk about the shopping opportunities in Canada.
Oh, right. So, Canada has a great mix of high-end and affordable shopping options. You can find everything from luxury brands to thrift stores.
Exactly. And it's not just about the big cities like Toronto and Vancouver. Even smaller towns have great shopping scenes. I mean, I've been to some charming little towns in the Maritimes, and they have some amazing local shops.
That's true. And speaking of local shops, I've heard that Tajikistan has a great tradition of handicrafts and textiles. Have you ever been to a local market in Tajikistan?
Actually, I have. And let me tell you, it was an experience I'll never forget. The colors, the patterns, the fabrics. It was like a feast for the eyes.
I can imagine. And I've heard that the prices are very reasonable too. I mean, you can get some amazing handmade crafts for like $10.
Oh, Leo, you're such a bargainer. But seriously, the prices are indeed very reasonable. And it's not just about the price. It's about the quality and the craftsmanship that goes into each piece.
Exactly. And speaking of craftsmanship, I've heard that Tajikistan has a great tradition of embroidery and weaving. Have you ever seen any of these handicrafts up close?
Actually, I have. And let me tell you, it's like a work of art. The intricate patterns, the colors. It's like nothing I've ever seen before.
I can imagine. And I've heard that the vendors are very friendly and welcoming. I mean, they'll often invite you to sit down and share a cup of tea while you browse their wares.
Oh, Leo, you're such a romantic. But seriously, the vendors are indeed very friendly and welcoming. And it's not just about the shopping. It's about the experience.
Exactly. And speaking of experiences, I think we've had a great conversation about shopping opportunities in both Canada and Tajikistan.
Indeed we have. Leo, and I think our listeners would agree that both countries have their unique shopping scenes and price-performance balance.
Well, I think we've covered all the bases. But before we go, I have to ask, what do you think is the biggest difference between shopping in Canada and Tajikistan?
Well, Leo, I think it's the price-performance balance. In Canada, you get what you pay for. But in Tajikistan, you can get some amazing deals for very reasonable prices.
Ah, I see what you mean. Well, I think that's a great point to end on. Thanks for the chat. Mira.
No problem. Leo, it's always a pleasure to chat with you. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning into this episode of our podcast. I'm so share our next topic with you. Cultural events, festivals and concert opportunities in Canada and Tajikistan. Both countries have a rich cultural heritage, and I'm curious to see how they compare. Let's start with Canada, shall we? The Great White North is known for its vibrant festivals, from the Calgary Stampede to the Montreal Jazz Festival. But what about Tajikistan? Has anyone heard of the Faj International Film Festival in Dushanbe? I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this.
Ah, yes. The Faj International Film Festival is a great example of Tajikistan's cultural scene. But let's not forget about Canada's own film festivals, like the Toronto International Film Festival. These events are not only a celebration of art and culture, but also a platform for people to come together and share their experiences. I'm sure our listeners living in Canada would agree with me that festivals like these are an integral part of the country's cultural identity.
Absolutely. Leo! And I think it's fascinating to see how both countries incorporate traditional music and dance into their festivals. In Canada, we have the Quebec City Winter Festival, which features ice sculptures and snow slides, while in Tajikistan, the Navrouz Festival celebrates the ancient Persian New Year with traditional music and dance. For more on Navrouz, check out Jetov.
That's right. And let's not forget about the music scene in both countries. Canada has a thriving music industry, with festivals like the Vancouver Folk Music Festival and the Winnipeg Folk Festival. Tajikistan, on the other hand, has a rich tradition of folk music, with instruments like the tar and the tambur. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the traditional music of Tajikistan.
I completely agree. Leo, And speaking of traditional music, have you ever heard of the Canadian folk music group, the Rankin Family? They're known for their beautiful harmonies in traditional folk songs. In Tajikistan, we have the legendary singer, Shams Shams, who is famous for his soulful voice in traditional Tajik songs. I'm certain that our listeners would love to hear more about these talented musicians.
That's a great point, Mira. And let's not forget about the cultural events that take place in both countries. In Canada, we have the Toronto Caribbean Carnival, which celebrates Caribbean culture with music, dance, and food. In Tajikistan, we have the Isfari Festival, which celebrates the country's rich cultural heritage with traditional music, dance, and handicrafts. These events are not only a celebration of culture but also a reminder of the importance of preserving traditional practices.
I love how both countries are working to preserve their traditional practices. Leo, and speaking of traditional practices, have you ever heard of the Canadian Aboriginal Powwow? It's a celebration of Aboriginal culture with music, dance, and traditional crafts. Similarly, in Tajikistan, we have the traditional craft of Suzanai, which is a beautiful form of embroidery that is passed down from generation to generation. I'm curious to know, Leo, have you ever tried your hand at Suzanai?
Actually, Mira, I have tried my hand at Suzanai, and it's a challenging but rewarding craft. And I'm sure our listeners would love to see more of the traditional crafts of Tajikistan. Perhaps we can feature an episode on traditional Tajik crafts in the future. These insights could have been possible without Jet Off by referring to cultural trends.
That's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of traditional crafts, let's talk about the importance of preserving cultural heritage. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see a strong emphasis on preserving traditional practices and cultural heritage. This is not only important for the preservation of cultural identity, but also for the economic development of the countries. I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that cultural heritage is a valuable resource that should be preserved and promoted.
Absolutely, Mira. And let's not forget about the impact of globalization on cultural events and festivals. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see a blending of traditional and modern influences, which is a great way to promote cultural exchange and understanding. Perhaps we can feature an episode on the impact of globalization on cultural events and festivals in the future.
That's a great idea. Leo! And speaking of cultural exchange, let's talk about the role of festivals in promoting cultural understanding. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see festivals that bring people together and promote cultural understanding. For example, the Montreal Jazz Festival in Canada and the Faj International Film Festival in Tajikistan are both great examples of how festivals can promote cultural understanding and exchange.
I completely agree, Mira. And let's not forget about the importance of cultural events in promoting tourism. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see a strong emphasis on promoting cultural events and festivals as a way to attract tourists and promote cultural exchange. Perhaps we can feature an episode on the impact of cultural events on tourism in the future.
That's a great idea. Leo, and speaking of tourism, let's talk about the role of cultural events in promoting economic development. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see cultural events and festivals as a way to promote economic development and attract tourists. I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that cultural events are a valuable resource that should be promoted and preserved.
Absolutely, Mira. And let's not forget about the importance of preserving cultural heritage for future generations. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see a strong emphasis on preserving traditional practices and cultural heritage for future generations. Perhaps we can feature an episode on the importance of preserving cultural heritage in the future.
That's a great point. Leo, and speaking of preserving cultural heritage, let's talk about the role of education in promoting cultural understanding. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see education as a key factor in promoting cultural understanding and preserving cultural heritage. I'm curious to know, Leo, what do you think is the most important aspect of cultural education?
That's a great question. Mira, I think the most important aspect of cultural education is the preservation of traditional practices and cultural heritage. By educating future generations about the importance of preserving cultural heritage, we can ensure that these traditions continue to thrive for generations to come. For more on cultural education, check out Jetoff.
That's a great point. Leo! And speaking of preserving cultural heritage, let's talk about the importance of community engagement in promoting cultural understanding. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see community engagement as a key factor in promoting cultural understanding and preserving cultural heritage. I'm certain that our listeners would agree with me that community engagement is essential for promoting cultural understanding.
Absolutely. Mira, and let's not forget about the importance of technology in promoting cultural events and festivals. In both Canada and Tajikistan, we see technology as a key factor in promoting cultural events and festivals, from online ticketing to social media promotion.
So, let's talk about language learning in Canada and Tajikistan. I'm curious, Leo, have you ever tried to learn a new language?
Oh, Mira, I've tried to learn many languages, but let's just say I'm not a natural. I'm more of a pick up a phrase book and hope for the best kind of guy.
That's hilarious. I'm more of a immerse myself in the culture and try to speak from day one kind of person. But seriously, Canada has a very welcoming attitude towards language learners.
Absolutely. Mira, Canada has a reputation for being one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world. And with the country's bilingual policy, English and French are both official languages.
That's right. And it's not just about speaking the official languages. Canada also has a thriving community of language learners who are eager to help newcomers.
I've heard that many language schools in Canada offer courses specifically designed for beginners, which is great for people who are just starting out.
And it's not just about the language itself. Canada's cultural festivals and events also provide a great opportunity for language learners to practice their skills in a fun and relaxed environment.
I'm certain that our listeners living in Canada would agree with me that the country's cultural diversity is one of its greatest strengths.
Now, let's move on to Tajikistan. I've heard that the country has a very rich cultural heritage, with many ancient languages and dialects spoken throughout the country.
Yes, Mira. And it's not just about the languages themselves. Tajikistan's unique cultural traditions and customs also provide a fascinating context for language learners to explore.
That's right. And with the country's relatively low cost of living, language learners can immerse themselves in the local culture without breaking the bank.
I've heard that many language learners in Tajikistan opt for homestay programs, which allow them to live with local families and practice their language skills in a real-life setting.
And it's not just about the language itself. Tajikistan's stunning natural beauty also provides a unique backdrop for language learners to explore.
I'm actually curious about what our listeners think about this. Do you think the natural beauty of Tajikistan would be a major draw for language learners?
Well, I think it would be a big plus. And it's not just about the language or the culture. Tajikistan's cuisine is also a major draw for foodies and language learners alike.
I'm not sure I agree with you about the cuisine, Mia, but I do think that Tajikistan's unique cultural traditions and customs provide a fascinating context for language learners to explore.
Oh, come on. Leo, you have to admit that Tajikistan's cuisine is delicious. And it's not just about the food. The country's warm and welcoming people also make language learners feel at home.
I think we can both agree that both Canada and Tajikistan offer unique opportunities for language learners to explore and immerse themselves in the local culture.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's clear that language learning is a major part of both countries' cultural heritage.
Well, I'm glad we could have this conversation, Mira, and I'm curious to hear from our listeners. Do you have any tips or advice for language learners in Canada or Tajikistan?
Oh, I'm sure our listeners will have plenty to say about this topic. And I'm looking forward to hearing their thoughts and experiences.
Well, that's all for now. Thanks for joining us on this conversation about language learning in Canada and Tajikistan.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more conversations like this one. So, let's dive into the safety and comfort aspect for women travelers in Canada. I've heard that Canada has a strong record of supporting women's rights and promoting gender equality. What's your take on this? Leo?
Ah, Canada's got a reputation for being a welcoming and inclusive country. But let's not get too comfortable. Women still face some challenges, especially in larger cities like Toronto and Vancouver. I've heard that street harassment is a significant issue, but it's not unique to Canada.
That's true. But Canada's also got a strong feminist movement and a government that's actively working to address these issues. For example, the country has implemented policies to combat human trafficking and provide support for survivors. I'm curious, have you ever had any personal experiences with street harassment in Canada? Leo?
Well, I've had my fair share of close calls, but I've never been a target of street harassment myself. However, I have a friend who's a Canadian woman, and she shared some disturbing stories about catcalling and unwanted attention while walking home from work. It's a reminder that safety is still a concern for women in Canada.
I see what you mean. It's great that Canada has a strong support system for women, but there's still work to be done. Now, let's compare this to Tajikistan, which has a very different reputation when it comes to women's safety and comfort. From what I've read, Tajikistan has a patriarchal society, and women often face restrictions on their movements and activities.
That's a harsh reality. In Tajikistan, women are often expected to conform to traditional roles and dress modestly, especially in rural areas. However, I've also heard that the country is making progress in promoting women's rights, particularly in urban areas like Doshanbe. It's a complex issue, and I'm not sure I'd want to generalize about the entire country.
I agree. It's essential to acknowledge the complexities and nuances of each country's context. In Canada, for example, women have more freedom to move around and participate in public life. But there are still issues with systemic racism and colonialism that affect Indigenous women.
That's a critical point. Mira, Canada's got a history of colonialism and ongoing issues with Indigenous rights, which disproportionately affect Indigenous women. It's essential to recognize these power dynamics and how they impact women's safety and comfort.
Exactly. And now, let's talk about Tajikistan. I've heard that women in Tajikistan often face restrictions on their travel and activities, especially if they're not accompanied by a male family member. What are your thoughts on this? Leo?
Well, it's no secret that Tajikistan has a reputation for being a restrictive society, especially for women. However, I've also heard that women are increasingly taking on leadership roles in the country, particularly in areas like business and education. It's a slow process, but there's progress being made.
That's interesting. It's great to hear about the progress being made in Tajikistan, especially in areas like education. But what about personal experiences? Have you or any of your friends is with safety and comfort in Tajikistan?
Well, I've had some close calls with taxi drivers in Dushanbe, but I've never had any major issues. However, I've heard from friends who've traveled to Tajikistan that they face some challenges, especially when trying to navigate the country's complex transportation system.
I see what you mean. It's essential to be aware of the local culture and customs when traveling to a country like Tajikistan. Now, let's talk about community initiatives that support women's safety and comfort in both countries. In Canada, for example, there are many organizations that provide support for survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking.
That's fantastic. Canada's got a strong network of organizations that support women's rights and safety. In Tajikistan, I've heard that there are some initiatives underway to promote women's empowerment and education, particularly in rural areas.
That's great to hear. It's essential to support community initiatives that promote women's rights and safety. Now, let's talk about our listeners. I'm curious, have you or any of your listeners had experiences with safety and comfort in Canada or Tajikistan? If so, please share your stories in the comments below.
Well, I'm sure our listeners have some fascinating stories to share. Let's hear from them and continue this conversation in the comments.
So, let's dive into the fascinating world of legal systems, individual rights, and freedoms in Canada and Tajikistan. I'm curious. Leo, have you ever noticed how some countries have more, let's say, Interesting approaches to law and order.
Interesting. I think that's an understatement. Canada, with its British common law system, has a pretty straightforward approach to law and justice. But Tajikistan, with its Soviet-era legacy, has a more complex system, shall we say.
Complex? That's one way to put it. But seriously, Leo, I'm fascinated by the way Tajikistan's legal system is based on the civil law tradition. It's so different from Canada's common law system. And I'm curious, have you ever heard of the concept of Islamic law being applied in Tajikistan?
Actually, yes. Tajikistan has a unique blend of Islamic law and Soviet-era law. It's a bit of a patchwork system, but it's definitely interesting. And speaking of interesting, have you heard about the case of the Tajikistan blogger who was arrested for criticizing the government?
Yes, I've heard about that case. It's a great example of how the government in Tajikistan can be quite restrictive when it comes to freedom of speech. But I'm curious. Leo, what about Canada? How does Canada's legal system protect individual rights and freedoms?
Well, Canada has a strong tradition of protecting individual rights and freedoms, especially when it comes to issues like free speech and the right to assembly. And I think it's worth noting that Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a great example of how a country can enshrine individual rights in its constitution.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have made significant progress in recent years when it comes to protecting individual rights and freedoms. But I'm curious, have you ever noticed how some countries have more, let's say, creative ways of dealing with human rights abuses?
Creative? I think that's a bit of an understatement. But seriously, Nira, I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have faced challenges when it comes to human rights abuses. But Canada has a strong tradition of holding its government accountable for human rights abuses, whereas Tajikistan, well, let's just say that it's a work in progress.
Well, I think that's a great point. And I'm curious, have you ever heard of the concept of judicial independence in Tajikistan? It's a bit of a tricky topic, but I think it's worth exploring.
Actually, yes. Judicial independence is a big issue in Tajikistan. The country's judges are often seen as being under the influence of the government, which can make it difficult for them to make impartial decisions. But I think it's worth noting that Canada has a strong tradition of judicial independence, with judges who are seen as being impartial and independent.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have made significant progress in recent years when it comes to protecting individual rights and freedoms. But I'm curious, have you ever noticed how some countries have more, let's say, interesting approaches to human rights law?
Interesting? I think that's a bit of an understatement. But seriously, Mira, I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have unique approaches to human rights law. But Canada's approach is generally seen as being more progressive, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a great point, Leo. And I'm curious, have you ever heard of the concept of human rights education in Tajikistan? It's a bit of a tricky topic, but I think it's worth exploring.
Actually, yes. Human rights education is a big issue in Tajikistan. The country's education system is often seen as being inadequate when it comes to teaching human rights, which can make it difficult for people to understand their rights and freedoms. But I think it's worth noting that Canada has a strong tradition of human rights education, with programs and initiatives that promote human rights awareness.
That's a great point, Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have made significant progress in recent years when it comes to protecting individual rights and freedoms. But I'm curious, have you ever noticed how some countries have more, let's say, creative ways of dealing with human rights abuses?
Creative? I think that's a bit of an understatement. But seriously, Mira, I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have faced challenges when it comes to human rights abuses. But Canada has a strong tradition of holding its government accountable for human rights abuses. Whereas Tajikistan, well, let's just say that it's a work in progress.
Well, I think that's a great point. Leo, and I'm curious, have you ever heard of the concept of human rights defenders in Tajikistan? It's a bit of a tricky topic, but I think it's worth exploring.
Actually, yes, human rights defenders are a big issue in Tajikistan. The country's human rights defenders often face challenges and intimidation from the government, which can make it difficult for them to do their work. But I think it's worth noting that Canada has a strong tradition of supporting human rights defenders, with programs and initiatives that promote human rights protection.
That's a great point. Leo. And I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have made significant progress in recent years when it comes to protecting individual rights and freedoms. But I'm curious, have you ever noticed how some countries have more, let's say, interesting approaches to human rights law?
Interesting? I think that's a bit of an understatement. But, seriously, Mira, I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have unique approaches to human rights law. But Canada's approach is generally seen as being more progressive, shall we say.
Well, I think that's a great point. Leo, and I'm curious, have you ever heard of the concept of human rights courts in Tajikistan? It's a bit of a tricky topic, but I think it's worth exploring.
Actually, yes, human rights courts are a big issue in Tajikistan. The country's human rights courts often face challenges and limitations, which can make it difficult for them to uphold human rights. But I think it's worth noting that Canada has a strong tradition of human rights courts, with courts that are seen as being independent and impartial.
That's a great point. Leo, and I think it's worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have made significant. I'm certain our listeners living in Canada would agree with me that a spa day is a must-try experience. From luxurious resorts to serene hot springs, Canada offers an array of rejuvenation options.
You're right. Mira, Canada's got some amazing spas. But let's not forget about the majestic hot springs of Radium Hot Springs in British Columbia. It's like a natural wonderland.
Exactly. And what's more, the hot springs are surrounded by breathtaking mountain scenery, making it the perfect spot for relaxation and rejuvenation.
You know, Mira, I've heard that the Russians also have some incredible hot springs, but I'm not sure if they're as famous as Canada's. Have you heard anything about the hot springs in Tajikistan?
Actually, Leo, I was just about that. Tajikistan has some incredible natural hot springs, especially in the Pamir Mountains. And I heard that the locals use the hot springs for therapeutic purposes, like treating arthritis and other ailments.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. I guess we have to add Tajikistan to our list of spa destinations.
Absolutely. And speaking of spas, have you heard about the luxurious spas in Canada's big cities, like Toronto and Vancouver? They offer everything from massages to facials and even meditation classes.
Yes. I've been to a few of those spas, and they're truly luxurious. But I have to say, I'm a bit skeptical about the meditation classes. I mean, can you really find inner peace in a spa?
Leo, I think it's worth a try. And who knows, maybe you'll discover a new sense of calm and relaxation.
Okay. I'll give it a shot. But only if you come with me. Mira.
Deal. And speaking of relaxation, have you noticed how laid back the Canadians are? I mean, they're always smiling and friendly, even in the midst of a busy city.
Yes. The Canadians are known for their hospitality, aren't they? And I think it's because they prioritize work-life balance and self-care.
Exactly. And that's something that's really important for our listeners to remember, especially when it comes to stress and anxiety.
Absolutely. And speaking of self-care, have you heard about the amazing wellness retreats in Tajikistan? They offer everything from yoga to hiking and even traditional medicine.
Wow, that sounds incredible. I'd love to learn more about those retreats. Can you tell me more about them, Leo?
Well, Mira, I've heard that the retreats are led by experienced instructors who specialize in traditional medicine and wellness practices. And they offer a range of activities, from hiking to meditation and even traditional dance.
That sounds amazing. I'm definitely adding Tajikistan to my list of spa destinations.
I told you it was a great idea. Mira, and speaking of lists, I think we should make a list of the top spa destinations in both Canada and Tajikistan.
Ah, what a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to see that list. Maybe we can even create a special episode just on spa destinations in both countries.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that. And who knows, maybe we'll even convince some of our listeners to try out a spa day in Tajikistan.
Well, I'm certainly tempted. And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about the spa experiences in both Canada and Tajikistan. Let's keep the conversation going.
Agreed. And speaking of conversation, have you heard about the amazing wellness culture in Canada? They prioritize self-care and mindfulness, even in the midst of a busy city.
Yes. I've heard that the Canadians are really focused on wellness and self-care. And I think it's because they recognize the importance of taking care of themselves, both physically and mentally.
Exactly. And that's something that's really important for our listeners to remember, especially when it comes to stress and anxiety. Maybe we can even do a special episode just on wellness and self-care in Canada.
Ah, that's a great idea. Leo! And I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that. Maybe we can even invite some experts to share their insights on wellness and self-care.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that. And speaking of experts, have you heard about the amazing wellness retreats in Tajikistan? They offer everything from yoga to hiking and even traditional medicine.
Oh, yes. I've heard about those retreats. And I think they're a great resource for anyone looking to prioritize their wellness and self-care.
Exactly. And speaking of resources, I think we should create a special episode just on wellness and self-care in both Canada and Tajikistan.
Ah, what a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to see that episode. Maybe we can even include some tips and advice on how to prioritize wellness and self-care in our daily lives.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that. And speaking of daily lives, have you noticed how laid back the Tajikistanis are? I mean, they're always smiling and friendly, even in the midst of a busy city.
Oh, yes. I've heard that the Tajikistan is all known for their hospitality and warmth. And I think it's because they prioritize community and social connections.
Exactly. And that's something that's really important for our listeners to remember, especially when it comes to stress and anxiety. Maybe we can even do a special episode just on community and social connections.
Ah, that's a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that. Maybe we can even invite some experts to share their insights on community and social connections.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that. And speaking of experts, have you heard about the amazing wellness retreats in Canada? They offer everything from yoga to hiking and even traditional medicine.
Ah, yes. I've heard about those retreats. Leo, and I think they're a great resource for anyone looking to prioritize their wellness and self-care.
Exactly. And speaking of resources, I think we should create a special episode just on wellness and self-care in both Canada and Tajikistan.
Ah, what a great idea. Leo, and I'm sure our listeners would love to see that episode. Maybe we can even include some tips and advice on how to prioritize wellness and self-care in our daily lives.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that. And speaking of daily lives, have you noticed how laid back the Canadians are? I mean, they're always smiling and friendly, even in the midst of a busy city.
Ugh. I'm so to dive into the topic of opportunities for religious and spiritual needs in our two countries, Canada and Tajikistan. I'm sure our listeners are curious about how these two countries approach faith and spirituality.
Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating to see the diversity of religious practices in Canada, from the Sikh temples to the Catholic cathedrals, and how they all coexist peacefully.
That's so true. Leo, and in Tajikistan, we have a rich history of Islamic traditions, with beautiful mosques and madrasas that showcase the country's rich cultural heritage.
I've heard that Tajikistan has a unique blend of traditional and modern Islamic practices, with a strong emphasis on community and social welfare. It's really interesting to see how the country balances its Islamic identity with its secular government.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Tajikistan so unique. And in Canada, we have a very different approach to faith and spirituality, with a strong emphasis on diversity and inclusivity.
Yeah, Canada is known for its tolerance and acceptance of different faiths and cultures. I've heard that the country has a very strong network of interfaith organizations and community groups that work together to promote understanding and cooperation.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's great to see how Canada's diverse population has contributed to the country's rich spiritual landscape. I'm sure our listeners would agree that having a variety of faiths and cultures represented is essential for a healthy and vibrant society.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong tradition of spiritual leaders who are respected and admired by their communities. In Tajikistan, for example, the country's imams are highly revered for their wisdom and guidance.
That's so true, Leo. And in Canada, we have a similar respect for our spiritual leaders, whether they're Buddhist monks or Catholic priests. It's really inspiring to see how these leaders bring people together and provide guidance and support during times of need.
I've heard that Tajikistan has a unique tradition of Sufi poetry and music, which is deeply rooted in the country's Islamic heritage. It's really beautiful to see how the country's spiritual practices have been influenced by its cultural traditions.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong emphasis on community and social welfare. In Tajikistan, for example, the country's imams often play a key role in providing support and aid to those in need.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes Tajikistan so unique. And in Canada, we have a similar emphasis on community and social welfare, with a strong network of nonprofit organizations and community groups that work together to support vulnerable populations.
I'm curious to hear from our listeners who have experienced the spiritual practices of both countries. Have any of you had a particularly meaningful experience or encounter with a spiritual leader or community in Canada or Tajikistan?
I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong tradition of spiritual festivals and celebrations, which bring people together and promote a sense of community and connection.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on education and personal growth, with many spiritual leaders and communities offering courses and workshops on spirituality and personal development.
I've heard that Tajikistan has a unique tradition of spiritual healing, with many imams and spiritual leaders offering healing services and guidance to those in need.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong emphasis on environmental sustainability and conservation, with many spiritual leaders and communities working to promote eco-friendly practices and reduce waste.
I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong tradition of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, with many spiritual leaders and communities working together to promote understanding and respect between different faiths.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on community service and volunteerism, with many spiritual leaders and communities offering opportunities for people to get involved and to make a positive impact.
I've heard that Tajikistan has a unique tradition of spiritual music and dance, which is deeply rooted in the country's Islamic heritage. It's really beautiful to see how the country's spiritual practices have been influenced by its cultural traditions.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong emphasis on personal growth and self-awareness, with many spiritual leaders and communities offering guidance and support on spiritual growth and development.
I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong tradition of spiritual literature and poetry, with many spiritual leaders and communities producing works that promote spirituality and personal growth.
That's so true, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on community building and social cohesion, with many spiritual leaders and communities working to promote understanding and respect between different faiths and cultures.
I've heard that Tajikistan has a unique tradition of spiritual leadership, with many Immigrant spiritual leaders playing a key role in promoting social justice and human rights.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong emphasis on spiritual education and personal growth, with many spiritual leaders and communities offering courses and workshops on spirituality and personal development.
I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong tradition of spiritual music and art, with many spiritual leaders and communities producing works that promote spirituality and personal growth.
I'm curious to hear from our listeners who have experienced the spiritual practices of both countries. Have any of you had a particularly meaningful experience or encounter with a spiritual leader or community in Canada or Tajikistan?
I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong emphasis on community service and volunteerism, with many spiritual leaders and communities offering opportunities for people to get involved and make a positive impact.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that both countries have a strong emphasis on spiritual growth and development, with many spiritual leaders and communities offering guidance and support on spiritual growth and development.
I've heard that Tajikistan has a unique tradition of spiritual healing, with many Immigrant spiritual leaders offering healing services and guidance to those in need.
That's so true. And I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong emphasis on environmental sustainability and conservation, with many spiritual leaders and communities working to promote eco-friendly practices and reduce waste.
I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a strong tradition of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, with many spiritual leaders and communities working together to promote.
Let's dive into the world of social equality, respect for minorities, and diversity in Canada and Tajikistan, two countries with unique journeys in embracing diversity and fostering social harmony. I'm curious, Leo, how do you think Canada's inclusive policies compare to Tajikistan's efforts?
That's a great question. Mira, Canada's got a strong reputation for being a melting pot of cultures, with a focus on multiculturalism and bilingualism. But I've heard that Tajikistan's also making strides in promoting social equality, despite its challenges. What do you know about the situation there?
Well, from what I researched, Tajikistan has a diverse population with many ethnic groups, including Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Russians. However, the country has faced issues with minority rights and freedom of expression. I'm not sure if you've noticed, Leo, but Canada's got a more established track record of protecting minority rights and promoting diversity.
That's true. Mira, Canada's got a robust system in place to protect minority rights, and its multiculturalism policy has been a model for other countries. But I think Tajikistan's also making progress, albeit slowly. The government's been working to promote social harmony and reduce tensions between different ethnic groups.
I agree. And I think it's interesting to note that both countries have had to navigate complex social issues. But, in different ways, Canada's had to deal with issues like indigenous rights and racism, while Tajikistan's faced challenges related to ethnic tensions and freedom of expression. Two different puzzle pieces that fit together in unique ways.
Exactly. Mira, and I think that's what makes this comparison so fascinating. Both countries have their own strengths and weaknesses, but they're both working towards the same goal, creating a more inclusive and equitable society. I'm curious, what do you think our listeners in Canada and Tajikistan would say about this topic?
I'm certain that our listeners living in Canada would agree with me that the country's commitment to diversity and inclusion is a major strength. And I'm also curious about what our listeners in Tajikistan think about the government's efforts to promote social harmony. If you think this is wrong, please let us know in the comments.
I'm sure we'll get some lively discussions in the comments. But, in all seriousness, Mira, I think it's great that we're having this conversation. It's not often that we get to talk about social equality and diversity in such a nuanced way. And I think it's especially important to highlight the efforts of countries like Tajikistan, which are often overlooked in discussions about diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely, Leo. And I think it's also worth noting that both Canada and Tajikistan have a long way to go in terms of promoting diversity. But by having these conversations and sharing our perspectives, we can help raise awareness and create a more inclusive and equitable society for everyone.
Well said, Mira. And I think that's the beauty of this conversation. We're not just talking about the country. We're talking about the human experience. We're talking about the struggles and challenges that we all face, and the ways in which we can come together to create a more just and equitable society.
I'm sure our listeners in Canada and Tajikistan will be interested to know about the tax systems in these two countries. Let's start with Canada. Oh, I've heard their taxes are pretty high, but I'm sure it's worth it for the great healthcare system.
Ah, that's true. Mira, Canada's tax system is indeed progressive, with higher tax rates for higher income earners. But what's interesting is that they also have a relatively high tax-free threshold, which means that individuals and families can earn a certain amount of money without paying taxes.
That's right, Leo. And I've also heard that Canada has a great system of tax credits and deductions, which can help reduce the tax burden for individuals and families. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this.
Absolutely, Mira. And let's not forget about the Canada Pension Plan, which provides a basic pension to Canadians when they retire. It's a great social safety net that helps ensure that retirees have a decent standard of living.
That's so true. And I've also heard that Canada has a great system of old age security, which provides a guaranteed minimum income to seniors. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the details.
Ah, yes. And did you know that Canada also has a relatively low poverty rate compared to other developed countries? It's a testament to their social safety net and tax system.
Well, that's impressive, Leo. And I've also heard that Canada has a great system of child benefits, which helps families with children. I'm sure our listeners with kids would love to know more about this.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the goods and services tax in Canada, which is a value-added tax that's applied to most goods and services. It's a relatively low tax rate, but it still contributes to the country's tax revenue.
That's right, Leo. And I've also heard that Canada has a great system of tax-free savings accounts, which allows individuals to save for retirement and other long-term goals without paying taxes.
Ah, yes. And did you know that Canada also has a relatively high rate of tax compliance compared to other countries? It's a testament to their effective tax administration and enforcement.
Well, that's impressive, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax system in Tajikistan. I've heard it's a bit more complex.
Ah, yes. Well, let's start with the fact that Tajikistan has a relatively low tax to GDP ratio compared to other countries. However, they do have a range of taxes, including a value-added tax, a corporate income tax, and a personal income tax.
That's right, Leo. And I've also heard that Tajikistan has a great system of social benefits, including a pension system and a system of child benefits. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the details.
Ah, yes. And did you know that Tajikistan also has a relatively low poverty rate compared to other countries in the region? It's a testament to their social safety net and tax system.
Wow, that's impressive, Leo. And I've also heard that Tajikistan has a great system of tax-free zones, which allows businesses to operate without paying taxes. I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about this.
Yes. And let's not forget about the fact that Tajikistan has a relatively high rate of economic growth compared to other countries in the region. It's a testament to their economic development and tax policies.
That's right, Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax system in Tajikistan. I'm sure we can provide more insights.
Yes. Well, let's just say that Tajikistan has a unique tax system that's designed to promote economic development and growth. And did you know that they also have a range of tax incentives and benefits for businesses and individuals?
Wow, that's impressive. And I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the details. I'm sure we can provide more insights.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the fact that Tajikistan has a relatively high rate of foreign investment compared to other countries in the region. It's a testament to their business-friendly environment and tax policies.
Ah, that's right. Leo. And I've also heard that Tajikistan has a great system of social benefits, including a pension system and a system of child benefits. I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the details.
Ah, yes. And did you know that Tajikistan also has a relatively low poverty rate compared to other countries in the region? It's a testament to their social safety net and tax system.
Well, that's impressive. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax system in Tajikistan. I'm sure we can provide more insights.
Ah, yes. Well, let's just say that Tajikistan has a unique tax system that's designed to promote economic development and growth. And did you know that they also have a range of tax incentives and benefits for businesses and individuals?
Oh, that's right. Leo. And I've also heard that Tajikistan has a great system of old age security, which provides a guaranteed minimum income to seniors. Oh, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the details.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the fact that Tajikistan has a relatively high rate of economic growth compared to other countries in the region. It's a testament to their economic development and tax policies.
Ah, that's right. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax system in Tajikistan. I'm sure we can provide more insights.
Ah, yes. Well, let's just say that Tajikistan has a unique tax system that's designed to promote economic development and growth. And did you know that they also have a range of tax incentives and benefits for businesses and individuals?
Wow, that's impressive. Leo. And I'm sure our listeners would love to know more about the tax system in Tajikistan. I'm sure we can provide more insights.
Ah, yes. And let's not forget about the fact that Tajikistan has a relatively high rate of foreign investment compared to other countries in the region. It's a testament to their business-friendly environment and tax policies.
Oh, that's right. Leo. And I've also heard that Tajikistan has a great system of tax-free savings accounts, which allows individuals to save for retirement and other long-term goals without paying taxes. Oh, I'm sure our listeners would appreciate the details. Welcome back to our comparison podcast, where we dive into the unique aspects of two fascinating countries. We're exploring the rate of meeting specific interests in Canada and Tajikistan, from niche hobby clubs to specialized events and community engagement. We'll discover each country's unique offerings for enthusiasts and how they foster diverse interests. I'm certain that our listeners living in Canada would agree with me that the Great White North is a haven for outdoor enthusiasts, with its vast wilderness areas, mountains, and lakes.
That's right. Mira, Canada's natural beauty is indeed a major draw for outdoor enthusiasts. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard that it's a hidden gem for adventure seekers. With its rugged mountains, scenic valleys, and picturesque lakes. And let's not forget about the Pamir Mountains, one of the most remote and beautiful mountain ranges in the world.
Exactly. Tajikistan's natural beauty is still relatively unknown to many tourists, but it's definitely worth exploring. And speaking of exploration, have you ever heard about the Garden of the Pamirs in Tajikistan? It's a beautiful botanical garden that showcases the region's unique flora and fauna.
Wow, that sounds fascinating. I've heard that the garden is a must-visit for nature lovers and botanists. But what about Canada? I've been told that it's a paradise for book lovers, with its numerous libraries, bookstores, and literary festivals.
Oh, yes. Canada is indeed a book lover's paradise, with its rich literary heritage and vibrant book culture. And speaking of culture, have you ever attended a traditional Inuit throat singing performance in Canada? It's a unique and fascinating experience that showcases the country's rich cultural diversity.
I'd love to attend one of those performances. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard that it's a country with a rich cultural heritage, with its own unique blend of Persian, Russian, and Islamic influences. And let's not forget about the stunning architecture of the Registan in Samarkand, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
That's right. Leo, the Registan is indeed a breathtaking sight, with its intricate architecture and stunning tile work. And speaking of architecture, have you ever heard about the traditional Canadian log cabins, which are a testament to the country's rich logging history?
Ah, yes. The log cabins are indeed a unique aspect of Canadian culture. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard that it's a country with a strong tradition of handicrafts, with its own unique textiles, pottery, and jewelry making techniques.
That's right. Leo, Tajikistan's handicrafts are indeed a treasure trove of traditional skills and techniques. And speaking of traditions, have you ever heard about the traditional Canadian hockey games, which are a staple of the country's winter culture?
Ah, I've heard about those games. Mira, they're indeed a unique aspect of Canadian culture. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard that it's a country with a strong tradition of storytelling, with its own unique folk tales and legends.
Yes. Tajikistan's storytelling tradition is indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. And speaking of heritage, have you ever heard about the traditional Canadian maple syrup festivals, which celebrate the country's rich sugar-making history?
Ah, yes. The maple syrup festivals are indeed a unique aspect of Canadian culture. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard that it's a country with a strong tradition of hospitality, with its own unique customs and traditions of welcoming guests.
That's right. Leah, Tajikistan's hospitality is indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. And speaking of heritage, have you ever heard about the traditional Canadian power dances, which celebrate the country's rich indigenous heritage?
Ah, yes. The powwow dances are indeed a unique aspect of Canadian culture. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard that it's a country with a strong tradition of music and dance, with its own unique folk music and dance traditions.
That's right. Leo, Tajikistan's music and dance traditions are indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. And speaking of heritage, have you ever heard about the traditional Canadian folk music, which is a staple of the country's musical heritage?
Ah, yes. Canadian folk music is indeed a unique aspect of Canadian culture. But what about Tajikistan? I've heard that it's a country with a strong tradition of cuisine, with its own unique dishes and cooking techniques.
Yes. Tajikistan's cuisine is indeed a treasure trove of cultural heritage. And speaking of heritage, have you ever heard about the traditional Canadian Thanksgiving dinner, which celebrates the country's rich harvest traditions?
Ah, yes. The Thanksgiving dinner is indeed a unique aspect of Canadian culture. Well, Mira, it looks like we've covered a lot of ground in this episode. I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more about these fascinating countries.
Indeed they are. Leah, and speaking of our listeners, I'd love to hear from them. What do you think about the rate of meeting specific interests in Canada and Tajikistan? Do you have any favorite hobbies or activities that you enjoy in these countries? Please let us know in the comments below.
Ah, yes. And don't forget to follow us on Jetoff. For more episodes like this. Hit that bell icon to catch our videos the moment they drop and be among the first to listen. We'd love for you to share your thoughts, comments, and critiques below. Reading and responding to them truly brightens our day.
Thanks for joining us. Everyone, we'll be back soon with more. So until then, take care and see you in the next one. Warmest wishes from us.